Dan DeSantos from Muddy Colors, and today I'm honored to be joined by Howard Lyon. Thank you, Howard.
Hi, yeah, it's great to be here.
So what are we going to talk about today, Howard?
I wanted to go over painting flesh tones, and we're going to look at painting a few different kinds of flesh tones, but I wanted to start out initially analyzing some skin from some artists that I really admire, whose work that I love, and also how to use photography, how to better use photography when we're painting from skin, when we're painting flesh.
Now, we've done a video with you before on actually how to paint a figure from life, and I've done some head painting demos, all of which have dealt somewhat with painting flesh tones. I felt like it was worthwhile to devote an entire video just to this because it seems to be not only such an important issue, but such a complex issue when it comes to making good paintings, and one that I think a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, that's true. It's hard. I think flesh gets very complicated because there really isn't a flesh tone. If
my crayon box has one though, Howard.
Yeah, that's right. But I have the flesh tube of paint. Yeah. What's wrong?
Did you ever use the flesh tube of paint in college? Did you buy that?
I did. Yeah. I think it was the Rembrandt flesh tube of paint.
Yeah, I think I had the Grumbacher one.
Really a beautiful color if you're like painting a Swedish fair-skinned Swede, then you might actually use that color.
Yeah, I found mine actually good for just about nothing. It mixed horribly with every color I could think of.
Oh, no.
Granted, I was fairly inexperienced at the time.
Yeah, I suppose I could see using it as like a base that you mix into, but mixing flesh colors isn't usually the issue. I think a lot of people can mix a color that represents a reasonable flesh tone, a mass tone when you're looking at skin. I think the real challenge in painting flesh is knowing what saturation levels to use and then putting together the right mix of color temperatures within that flesh range so that they don't feel muddy, so that they feel vibrant, and how saturated to keep the shadows, how saturated to keep the highlights, and kind of everything in between. And hopefully we'll be able to cover some of that today in a useful way. I find that we kind of went through a period in the 80s and 90s working from photography where it seemed like everyone looked like they had a fake tan. You look back even at the early Spectrum annuals, and a lot of the skin in it was very orange and very harsh. As photography and controlling white balances got better, I feel like some of our flesh tones have improved.
And do you feel like it got temporarily worse in the 80s? Because, prior to that, people probably would have been working from black and white reference, like Lyon and stuff like that. Do you think they did a better job at flesh tones?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned Lyon. Lyon was very adamant about just painting from life. In Norman Rockwell's biography, he writes about Lyon visiting his studio, and he came in and Rockwell had photographs spread out on the floor for a current painting. And he said Lyon wouldn't acknowledge them. In fact, he kept his eyes up because he didn't want to have that confrontation with Rockwell, because it was a point of contention between them of Lyon insisting on painting from life and Rockwell using photography. Isn't that funny?
That is funny.
Yeah. But I feel like illustrators and artists, they had been trained so much painting from life that they were very informed when they went to paint from photographs. And if they were working from black and white or they were working from color, they were able to inject more style, more painting more with deliberation and confidence because they had studied so much from life. The photography wasn't a compromise, but we get to the 70s and 80s and early 90s, and a lot of artists, you can see that they were copying the colors that they were seeing in the photographs, and so we get a lot of very orange skin in the pictures. It's really interesting.
I remember specifically interjecting colors. I remember from life painting class, blues and all these things I would see in real life that, my camera was absolutely incapable of capturing all throughout college and the first decade of my career, most likely.
It is amazing. And I feel like, digital photography still has a ways to go, but we'll look at some photographs here that I've taken And I feel like I'm able to get a lot more information out of them than I was even like 10 years ago.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
Now
right,
we're
it's
looking at a Bouguereau here, obviously,
yeah,
and I mean I probably put Bouguereau up there as one of my favorite artists, especially because of the way he paints flesh, which is just so incredibly subtle and
it really is remarkable. And there's the complexity of what we're seeing here is wonderful, where like if I eyedropper up here right where the flesh is meeting the head, we get a really beautiful color that's very saturated. One of the things that hopefully we can see well on the video is if you keep an eye on this hue box. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger.
yeah.
If you keep an eye on this box, um, you'll be able to see where the saturation is.
Hmm.
And so if you watch this move around, you'll see that in a lot of the light side of the flesh, the saturation stays about in the same place. We're not really moving much out of this range, and you'll see it drop down in value a little bit. But as we move over into the shadow, we're going to see a distinct change. So here we drop down in value, but as soon as we hit the shadow, it's going to jump over in saturation quite a bit.
Can we pause for just a moment, Howard? So, for anybody
Yeah.
that's not too familiar with Photoshop, what we're seeing here using the eyedropper tool, that's selecting the exact color on that face, and we're seeing
Right.
that large here on the palette. Is that collecting just one pixel, or is that an average of that small area? What are we looking at
Let's see.
specifically?
I've got it set to a single point sample.
Okay, cool.
But to make it smoother, I'm going to do something real quick that I'll do sometimes when I analyze flesh. I'm going to blur my image. So the quality of the stream didn't drop. I blurred the image, and that's going to kind of normalize some of the variation in the pixels, and it will let us, I think, get um, a little bit easier analysis.
Great. And then the hue box that we're looking at, this could essentially be the same thing on someone's palette. This would be, say, cad orange and on your palette, mixing it with varying degrees of white or black or gray to create all
That's
these
right.
hues here, right? Okay.
That's right. So look here, we'll kind of analyze this cheek and how it turns from light into dark. So if I eyedropper her up here, you're going to see we've got a fairly rosy color, but it's also I'd say in the upper 25% as far as saturation, like or desaturation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fairly gray.
Right. And it
It's a
looks
nice
kind of
gray
blue
paint.
there by comparison, really, on the
Yeah,
face
it
itself.
really does.
Yeah.
And there's an interesting phenomena at play that'll come back to in that regard. But let's kind of walk down this form. So as you can see, as I walk down this form and go across the cheek, we see it drop in value, but we also see it increase significantly in saturation, where it goes from about a 20% saturation. By the time we get to the shadow, we're at a 50% saturation. So that's a pretty profound change.
And did that do that on the forehead as well? Is that just a light shadow thing, or is that just a cheek thing?
That it does do it on the forehead. If you see as we go,
Just
we'll
to a
start up
lesser
here on
degree, a little.
the brightest spot. Yeah, let's kind of walk down. So we're seeing it drop in value, but it really hasn't changed in saturation much yet until we go up into the shadow right here. So right at the hairline.
Wow.
So he would really punch the saturation in the shadows and leave it fairly desaturated in the highlight areas.
Oh, that seems so opposite of what I'm used to hearing.
Yeah, you know what? There is kind of a school of thought um, that you get your highest point of saturation right at the terminator of the core shadow.
Hmm.
Right at where you cross over from the light side to the dark side. But yeah, it's almost impossible to use those terms without feeling geeked out a little bit. But Bouguereau approached his flesh more like it's a landscape painting than I think how a lot of artists today will instruct or talk about flesh. And we can see it down here on the neck again. So let's kind of look at where we're at on the neck, and let's go into this cast shadow here and look how big of a saturation jump that is
I feel
as we
like
go
it's
across.
also worth noting how small of a value jump it is. I typically see so many people just dumping blacks into their shadows and making their shadows much too dark, but that shadow under the chin is remarkably light in value, considering that it's still pretty dark compared to the rest of the face.
Right. And if we zoom out, we can see that a little bit stronger. But you're really right. I sometimes will see students in workshops, they will pull out the black to do the nostrils
Mhm.
and the corners around the mouth. But if we look at the value here, so that's the darkest part of the nostril. I'm going to go ahead and unblur this so we
Yeah.
can look a little bit closer. We'll go into this darkest part of the nostril here, and it's like almost a pure cad red deep, or maybe with a
Yeah.
little alizarin crimson in there. But it is just as bright of a dark red as he could get in there.
Right.
So there's not a lot of just black in there. In fact, if we make a little swatch that we can compare to, that might be handy. So there's black. Look how even he gets a ton of he's able to turn the form so effectively by varying the saturation as well as the value, but he's not pushing that value all that dark, not compared to black. Um, so I think there's a lot to learn there, um, about how just controlling the saturation levels will help you turn the form when you're painting flesh.
And speaking
And,
of learning from that, is this something you were taught in school? Is this something you were just kind of figuring out on your own to help your own work?
yeah, I think it came a lot from three things. One is obsessing over Bouguereau and how he painted flesh, and just being really puzzled because I would hear one thing about how to paint flesh. I was taught a very different kind of formula or process for painting flesh
Were you taught sort of
than
academically or?
no, I was taught more, like the specific instruction was that your colors lose saturation as they approach the brightest part of the light because they're getting washed out. And so your highest saturation is going to be right at that halftone, right at that
Hmm.
where the core shadow turns. And then your shadows, if you've got a warm light, are going to be cool. And if you've got a cool light, are going to be warm. But what I find in my own observations and in looking at Bouguereau and looking at artists that I like, um, is that the shadows generally stay warm. Across the board. It's just relative to how warm or cool the highlights are.
So why isn't there just a right answer to this? Can't we just look at something in a photo and eyedrop all of it and say, no, this is in fact what happens? Or why is it that? Because we look at Bouguereau, who seems to be breaking the rules, yet it somehow looks more real to me as a result. Or is it
Right.
really what's going on here? Why is it that we can't just why aren't artists agreeing on what it should be?
I think one of the reasons is that because stylistically there's so many things that you can do that are beautiful. I think a great example is Brahm. We look at the way you can look at the way Brahm paints, and he will use like cerulean blue or phthalo blue. I mean, that's just my guess. What it kind of looks like. He goes out to some great extremities, and there's this beautiful painting of like a Valkyrie that he did, and her hands are kind of a blue green, and then it gets into these beautiful warm peaches and rosy tones in the face, and we accept it as flesh, even though he's like pushed the colors far beyond what we observe
Yeah.
from life.
I see
But he's
to note even more extreme examples, I'll see artists like say Victo Nye or Tomer Hanukkah, and they'll use lime green and bizarre colors
right.
in an editorial work that still somehow like registers as flesh in my brain just
Yeah.
because of the relationships, I guess, to everything else.
That's right. I think that our mind is willing to accept a lot in terms of what actual flesh color is. In fact, we can do a quick test on this. We'll take this Bouguereau, and I like using the photo filter function in Photoshop sometimes. So here we just shifted all of the flesh tones to a very blue, so we can switch that back and forth,
Oh,
and
that
yet
looks
it
good.
still reads completely as flesh
Yeah,
tones.
it
In
looks like
fact,
maybe it's nighttime or something instead, but it's still
yeah,
flesh. Yeah.
yeah. Like all of a sudden she's lit with moonlight. And look at now the highlight color is in a very
Wow.
purple blue range, but it's acceptable as flesh.
Can
Like
we
there's
see, will
no,
you do the gradation on the cheek again? I would love to see
yeah,
how
yeah.
those rules still apply. And obviously the photo filter might be messing something up, but
Sure, but I think we're going to see the same thing. So look at these cooler tones right up by the eye, and
mhm.
then we go into warmer, richer kind of purples and magentas.
So we're changing the hue, which the warmth color is coming in, but also, yep, there's the
Right.
saturation and its value is all increasing. Huh.
And look how the shadows stayed warmer.
Yeah.
I think it's a good I think that reveals how even under cool lights, warm shadows work very well, and even under warm lights, the shadows stay very warm.
Oh man, it looks too warm now. And now that I see
Right? Yeah, it's like,
my
man,
eyes just adjusted to it,
yeah,
like sort of filtering out. There was an article recently about people's perception of blue and that our brains filter out the color because it's so dominant in our environment. But I think anything our brains just kind of adapt to. Right now, this looks horribly green, but you
yeah,
know, you watch a Matrix film or something, and by the end of that, or Fight Club, it's all green filters, Lord of the Rings as well. By the end,
yeah.
your brain is just adapted to that color. It looks totally normal.
Isn't that interesting? So it is. I mean, we accept it, and one of the reasons that it's acceptable for longtime readers of Muddy Colors, I did a post a long time ago. In fact, I don't think I was an actual contributor at the time. You just had me repost it on building harmonious color palettes.
I
And
remember that post. I thought you were a contributor by then, but fantastic post.
it, I think it's what after I did that, you said, "Hey, do you want to write for Muddy Colors?" So it, it was a good post for me to do. It opened doors for me at Muddy Colors. Um, it showed in that post that the colors that you use aren't very important. What is important is keeping harmonious relationships within those colors, and you can determine what those you can determine those relationships by the color of the light
Hmm.
that is affecting everything in your scene. So in this case, we've got a fairly green light or a very green light, and so we've shifted all of the colors. So look at the white. So
Mhm.
this is the whitest part of her blouse, but if we look at that color, it's green. I
Yeah,
mean,
and if
it's
we
like a
wanted to make that color, we would have to start with like a cad green light. Like what we see in the top right corner is the most saturated version of that hue. So,
that's right.
okay.
But
Um,
if we just asked, like if someone walked in the room and you said, "Hey, what color is this shirt?" They'd say white.
yeah.
You know, unless you said, "No, really, what color is it?" And then, you kind of look and think, "Well, I guess it's actually kind of green." But our brain is just wired to interpret
Yeah.
those things because of it. Now, something that we can do that's interesting.
I'm sorry, will you toggle back there real quick? Only because
Yeah.
we saw the specific color. Um, oh, I'm sorry, I
No, 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 you're
didn't mean to.
good. I
I would love to see what the red looked like in the mouth and nostrils since we saw that before and
right.
it was like that kind of rose madder deep. I wonder how much, because we're adding green in there, that really hasn't even changed that much. You would think that
No,
the
we
green would cancel out the red a bit, but
we shifted a lot towards we shifted a lot towards orange. So watch this right here. Watch this color shift happen. So see how it dropped into more of a
ah,
magenta range. So I did something. I pasted in her head over the green image. So there's the
yeah.
unadjusted head over the green.
Hmm.
And what this shows is how important maintaining the color temperature of the light in order to how maintaining the color temperature of the light helps you keep your colors harmonious. Because obviously her head no longer looks right in this scene.
Yeah.
Like we've got these cues that tells us either this is wrong or this is wrong. We can't have both at the same time. Now you can break that rule to add emphasis because it draws a lot of attention to her head to have a shift in temperature. Disney will do that all the time, where it will have a scene that's lit very cold, and then like Nemo will be under a very warm light in that same scene. And it doesn't really make sense from a physics standpoint, but it does a great job of drawing your eye to an area. So it's one way that you can break that rule to great effect. So I think the point of showing all of these examples is just that flesh color is so relative that what's more important is maintaining the relationships between the various flesh colors that you're using and not worrying as much about what actual flesh color is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but now we're looking, would these rules apply the same way to, say, somebody with dark skin? Right now we're looking at a really pale girl, so the
Right.
highlights are really white. But what happens if the highlights on the face, would they be as white on a dark person?
Yeah, they do. It applies in the same way, and I've got some photographs that we'll look at here in a minute. But this painting of the Oreads from Bouguereau, some of the satyrs in the front have a bit darker complexion, but we can see some of the same things happening. Now, this is an interesting Bouguereau to analyze because even though it's signed, it's considered to be unfinished.
Oh.
The contemporaries said, yeah, he didn't finish this piece. This was in 1902. So this was just 3 years before Bouguereau passed away. And while he still was hitting some home runs at this age, I think some of his stamina was on pieces might have fallen off. This piece is in the
Yeah,
Messina
yeah.
Orsi.
This piece looks real lazy.
Yeah, right. I mean, he only did 80 figures in the painting in their
Can you
life
zoom in?
size.
The women, God, the flesh tones really are remarkable on there. But I swear, say the
Yeah.
woman kind of central with the arm across her mouth, that shadow across her chest looks very blue to me. Can you eye
It
drop
does.
those again? Is that still getting more saturated than the highlight?
Yep. So look, let's go from
Wow.
this over into here and look. It's actually quite a bit more saturated, but it's still I wouldn't say that it's saturated. The watch as we go into the armpit here,
Yeah.
where whenever, just as a quick side note, whenever flesh meets flesh, that's where you get a lot of very intense color. Like look over on this foot here,
Yeah.
right where there's toes meet. But
I,
that's just kind of a good rule of
I have
thumb.
very few rules in art, but one of them is always use red in the cracks of flesh,
Yeah,
nostrils,
yeah,
toes, fingers, eyelids. That
yeah.
seems to be
It
one of the
look right
solid
here in
ones.
the belly button.
Now,
Yeah,
when you zoom out though, I would swear that shadow under her arm had to be. Look how blue it looks there
well,
comparatively.
and isn't that amazing that look what color it is? It's still orange. And
Yeah.
that's something that I want to show really quick. And this will be a good image. I'm glad you brought that up. So there's a neat tool in Photoshop called the Camera Raw filter. And it allows you to be very quickly and very selective on exactly what colors you're manipulating. So let's see if we can make this show up. Lightroom has these tools as well, and I usually will use Lightroom when I'm adjusting a batch of images. So, like you said, this looks very blue in here, but it's actually orange. And if we go into this tool where we have the HSL and grayscale, we can just adjust the saturation of the orange colors. So watch as I drop the orange down.
Wow, it's a black and white photo. It's pretty much
Right?
all orange.
All of the flesh color pretty much disappeared. We get a little bit of yellow, which is the color of the canvas coming through, the imprimatura that he had on the
My,
canvas.
that is remarkable. That looks like a grisaille right now underneath.
Yeah. And so I think what that tells us,
Look at the little bit amount of red as well. That's
yeah,
crazy.
there's like a little tiny touch of red on the nipple here and in between the toes. Um,
So you
but
could
it
paint 80% of this bouguereau using just cat orange, white, and black if you
and
were really
it's
controlled.
yeah, isn't that incredible?
Yeah. Wow.
Tells us a lot. As we bump the orange up,
I don't even have orange on my palette, Howard.
right? Yeah, that's what you were missing.
Yeah.
Now add it in. I'm gonna look. I've pushed the saturation up now, so this is where the saturation was just by default, and then I'll push the saturation up. There's a really cool phenomena that takes place, and that is that a color, when grayed down, will take on the properties of its complement when it has the same value. Um, so to try and clarify on that, we have these areas. So see, we get these kind of peachy reds right in here.
Mm-hmm.
And then right next to it, these colors feel more green.
Definitely.
Well, they are, I'm gonna get out of this so we can get back to using the eyedropper real quick. So I'm gonna zoom in here. Whoops, and I left the color a little more saturated, so it'll be a little more exaggerated. So let's look at this color. So we've got an orange, it doesn't have much variation in hue. If you look at this little slider here, you'll see very little adjustment in the hue. But as we go right over in here, see how it drops in saturation just a little bit?
Yeah.
And so it starts to look a little more green because it is going to start to take on the properties of the complement.
Man.
So we go from like an orange red color, and as we desaturate and we maintain a similar value, it's going to start to look a little bit green. And we get the same thing up here with these purples, where it's such a subtle shift.
Right.
So if you see where I go from here to here, see how the saturation drops?
And that's
Because of that, it looks a little more purple, a little more blue.
Man, it is so remarkably subtle. It seems almost impossible to be able to paint this subtly.
This is why no one paints like Bouguereau,
Yeah.
is because you're talking about such small, tiny shifts. Look at this. Like, do you want to guess?
Oh man. Yeah, all right. You didn't eye drop it yet? Oh, I was gonna guess it. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that is
It's
great.
phenomenal. And yet, look how the value doesn't change at all.
So
Notice how
actually,
this
do me a
stays
favor here.
horizontal.
Okay, so I
Yeah.
dropped that. So that's a very gray, kind of a lizard-y color. But we could
Yeah.
pretty much say it's pretty much gray, so it's feeling blue. Can you make I drop that color and select if we actually made that same sort of gray out of a blue? Is it even a noticeable difference if you
Let's
just
do that.
paint it in
Yeah.
next to that one?
Right. I'm going to put it on a big swatch so that we can see it very clearly. Okay. So there is that color. Now I'm going to switch to, I'll call it a cobalt blue.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be right in there.
Oh man, there is a remarkable difference there. Even
Yeah.
at that gray, I would think that you almost couldn't detect the hue, but yeah, yeah. Oh, fantastic.
Kind of amazing.
I wonder how
So,
blue is the blue in the sky. I bet it's practically gray as well then.
yeah. Let's see this kind of purpley color up here. Oh, look at that. Yeah,
Oh
it
my
hardly has
God.
any saturation. So, we might jump into a scene and be like, oh, here's my sky blue. Well, that would be like out of the tube
Yeah.
sky blue. He was he was so good at
Restraint. Yeah.
reserving those real saturated colors for just the right places, like in the nostril, on the lips, just a few places, and it gives such power and strength to the skin.
Yeah, I think that's probably where the realism is coming from. Yeah, he doesn't have to, if we paint, yeah, I tend to paint very high chroma myself. And so then by the time I get to those saturated areas, say between the toes, I need to be using colors right out of the tube. And they're
Right.
still not going to have the same level of impact because of saturation contrast that you could get if you just restrain yourself more.
That's right. And you said something very important there, and that is contrast.
Yeah.
That I think when we say the word contrast, we think of value contrast, but there's a great painting has every kind of contrast. It has edge contrast and detail and saturation and color and in the case of Bouguereau's flesh, having saturation contrast is very important. So if we didn't have that, these toes wouldn't feel like they're full of blood,
Yeah.
and this part of the foot wouldn't feel like it has thick, pasty skin over the top of it.
Man, that's a remarkable foot, by the way. Look at all the colors.
It
Oh, the
is
foot
so
just
great.
above it, too. Man, look at the color shift. Like you could tell she's been walking on those feet. They're just a little redder underneath.
Right. And a dangerous takeaway is for someone to look at this and think, to come away and like start painting the flesh with a full spectrum of color and wonder why they're not getting skin like Bouguereau if that's their goal.
Yeah.
But remember that this is just all variations of saturation within a very narrow range of yellows, oranges, and reds.
Nice. And so, how has this applied itself to your work? Are you now just kind of making up these things as you paint, or are you starting to notice that they're really there in real life? How is it actually implement itself?
You know, maybe there's some confirmation bias happening, but over the last couple of years, every Wednesday night I've done some life painting, and I've started to be more aware of the saturation levels that I'm painting with, and I'm keeping them more restrained, like Bouguereau, and finding that I have a lot more power in doing that. That by the time I get to like the inside of the ear or the where the lips meet or like light reflecting into the neck, I have this vast range of saturation levels that I can play with that makes the rest of my flesh look richer. I think it was Rubens that talked about, or it might have been Van Dyck who talked about uh, painting flesh and that the most important color is gray
Hmm.
within that. And if you, I think that, on the light side, especially, you're effectively dealing with grays. Any of these colors, if we isolated them and painted them on their own,
If you painted a room that color, people would say you had a gray room.
like, yeah, like that's a gray room.
Yeah.
We can even try, let's see, to jump out of the frame real quick and we'll make a new image because what I think might be interesting, or I can do it within the same image. Hold on. Let's see. Whoops, hit the wrong hotkey. Hold on. This image is massive. I captured this at the Dorsey. It's like
Oh, I was
12,000
wondering
pixels
why you
wide.
had such a remarkable shot. You just took a whole bunch of shots and straightened them out, photo merged them.
Yep. It was like 32 pictures that I
Oh
stitched
man.
together. And so some areas of it have higher resolution than others. But let's do this real quick. I'm
I,
going to do kind of a middle. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, a little off topic, but I think that level of restraint Bouguereau shows with saturation, it's also his edge control is much the same
Uh,
to me. It is so soft. So again, just these little parts pop off when you need them to. Like this woman's eyes I'm looking at now. They're just
yeah,
they're magnetic. You know.
you're absolutely right. I mean it. So interesting to just see that flesh color against gray.
Yeah.
It's just kind of this tan, very desaturated color.
That's
But
actually
yeah,
not too far off from my flesh tube.
there you go.
they
Finally.
they were right all along. So let's look a
Um,
little bit at the pan and stuff, the satyrs down below. Uh,
yeah. So
look at how black their hair is against the white of their skin. Man.
right. It's such a beautiful contrast. And I like how like this one has a little more of a blue black. Look at the
Hmm.
highlights in that
Yeah.
hair. Um, and then this is a little bit warmer. But we're gonna see the same thing. It just starts a little bit further down
Just
in the
moving the
value and
whole thing
saturation
down the
range.
scale a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it just shifted down the scale. But let's compare real quick this shadow
It
and this
shifted
shadow. Look
down
at
the.
that.
Do that again? I'm sorry.
I'm going to make a swatch. So this is the shadow on his neck
Yeah.
right here,
Hmm.
which is a very kind of transparent red oxide. Um,
Oof.
and I know, look at that against the flesh. Um, and then we'll get that little shadow right there. Um,
Oh man.
and just to see how they compare. So it's almost like where this shadow leaves off, it's just shifted down a little bit more. It might be interesting. And for the viewers, we're going a little bit kind of stream of consciousness here as we analyze these flesh tones and just making observations. But I think it's really fascinating to do.
All right, some of those blues in his back. I know you know the ones I'm talking about. Can we?
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
got to know what hue that is down near the
right
shoulder
here.
blades. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right,
right
I'm
there.
gonna guess that's going to be maybe at the top of your hue bar, kind of a pinkish purple, really grayed out.
Okay.
No, not even close.
It's like yellow, orange.
Oh
So
man,
we'll
do the one near
isolate
the
that color.
deltoid too, the deltoid tricep area.
Okay.
The dark, really blue, in more to your right, like 3 o'clock position from
Oh,
there.
right there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh my
No,
lord,
it's
it's
it's really the exact same color, just with light saturation. It
man.
in one way it tells me I'm working way too hard when I'm trying to mix up colors. And the other end, I'm not being nearly subtle enough with my changes in saturation.
Man. Uh, Now, Bouguereau, is any of this? I'm wondering if his relationships are being helped by his ground or if he's doing a grisaille. How does Bouguereau start off his paintings, and is that a
So
good way to accomplish
yeah,
this?
he did not do a grisaille, and
Mhm.
we know with confidence that he didn't because one, we can see unfinished paintings of his, but even more important are we have notes from his students. We know from like Daniel Parkhurst, who wrote the treatise on painting in oil, and he talks about the methodology and the teaching methods in the Beaux Arts Academy and the Julian Academy were almost codified by that point.
Mhm.
That there were set ways of approaching paintings by that kind of mid 19th century. So Bouguereau, there were two things that I think are big misconceptions about how Bouguereau painted flesh. The first is people think that maybe it was a Grisaille or Verdaccio underneath, but it
Mhm.
wasn't. He just had a toned canvas,
Mhm.
and
And it was
we
kind of
find
a light yellow tone or something
in
usually,
this
right?
case,
Yeah.
in this case, yes. Uh, we also have notes from the company that prepared his canvases,
Hmm.
and he would either tint with a kind of a cool gray, kind of like the value six Gamblin, or I
The
mean
golden,
golden
yeah,
that
gray
we were
six.
looking at the
Yeah.
other day,
Hmm.
um, or a pink color, and you can see that in some of his studies or some of his unfinished paintings,
Oh yeah,
or
that's right.
this kind of yellow that he would use. That's kind of like a golden ochre, yellow ochre, or a raw uh, sienna.
I think it's worth pointing out because of the grisaille thing. And I used to work kind of in a very classical fashion. I would do a highly detailed drawing or black and white rendering and then glaze in my color. And I ultimately stopped doing that because it didn't reproduce very well. But
Mm.
I think one of the main issues with doing the grisaille is that, we're talking about all this subtlety here, is that you're forcing yourself to overburden your values with all of your contrast, that everything has to work. Your form is developed between is it lighter or darker, and we don't even necessarily need those value shifts. So if we saw this in black and white, it might feel unfinished or not round enough or whatever because you're not taking into account the saturation you could have used instead of a value. I
Right.
don't think you could achieve the same subtlety if you did a pure black and white painting and then just glazed in all the color.
Yeah, it's wonderful that we have so many ways to do a painting. And so people do remarkable work with the grisaille. But I think in this case, like it almost to me comes down to a like conservation of effort, and that you don't need to do a grisaille in this case, and you spend your energies and you spend your efforts in trying to create those very subtle and beautiful shifts in saturation. And it's a better use of your time and energies rather than painting the entire grisaille and then painting over it and then trying to produce those shifts in color and saturation.
Yeah. Like, would you
But
zoom out here again, make that black and white
yeah,
for me again, please?
you bet. Oh, whoops, sorry.
Yeah. So when I look at it like this, those satyrs just kind of disappear. I would look at that and say, "Oh, they need much greater contrast. Those shadows need to be
Right.
darker, those highlights need to be lighter. They're blending into the background." And so if I approached it purely from a value standpoint, yeah, it wouldn't work for me this way.
It's true. We get to like look at this leg and his back, and there's very little difference between them. But when we switch to color, having the satyrs be in a much more yellow spectrum, a more olive skin, and then we have these more like Scandinavian skin tone right behind them. They pop quite a bit. Plus, their whole range of flesh is, as we saw when we were eyedropping, is in a much more heightened saturation, and so they're going to sit closer to the viewer because of that.
Awesome. This is remarkable, Howard. And you mentioned you have some photos you took as well that are
Yeah, yeah. Let's jump to those. I had a couple other like Bouguereau feet. This is from this beautiful painting, and you can see these wonderful grays that are in there to look at.
oh
Uh,
man. Yeah, I
you
don't mean
know,
to rush you. Should go over anything you'd like to go
yeah,
over.
yeah.
You've done Bouguereau studies, have you not?
I have, yeah, and they're very informative to do that. I feel like I learn a lot. It's kind of like if you want to understand Mozart, you need to learn to play Mozart on the piano. And copying and studying Bouguereau has helped a lot. This is Pompeo Batoni, and I thought I would put this in real quick just to show like this is a little bit different approach. Like it's very highly saturated. You can see this painting in the Met, and this is a download from the Met. He still has a significant shift in temperature, but his color starts out at a much higher saturation level in the highlights, and it's beautiful, but it doesn't have the subtlety and all of the little shifts in saturation that Bouguereau does
Yeah.
that I think create such luminous flesh.
This seems to me more typical of somebody like Lord Lytton or somebody as well.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
and
you're right.
maybe it comes from the glazing or something, but
It oh, I'm glad you mentioned that. With Bouguereau, he did not glaze on his flesh. Um, he painted directly, and we know that from the notes of his students and kind of him talking about the way that it would work. His students said that he would often finish ahead in 8 hours,
wow.
and so there's no glazing happening in that
Yeah.
time frame. He did use a medium that had almost picture varnish in it. And so within an 8 hour period, he could do some dry brushing over the top of it because that paint was going to
Oh,
tack up
really?
quite a bit.
Would he often do second coats over the face or really just kind
You
of
know,
one pass?
what you'll see with him is that it's usually he will do what they would call the eboche or the color wash or lay-in, and they would do that over the whole picture. And so it would have that initial kind of painting. And if you search for Bouguereau eboche, you're going to there are some of those survived, that didn't get finished and didn't get painted over. And so that 8 hours of finishing ahead is that second pass over the color wash. Um, I brought this church landscape up because if you look at the way Bouguereau turned forms, it's very similar to the way landscape painters will paint. And as you see the increased saturation and contrast in the foreground, and then pushing things to grays as we go into the background. And if you think of the face like a little landscape, where in the light side, as the form recedes, not into shadow, but just turning away from the viewer, it can become less saturated and it will aid in turning the form. But then once we get into the shadows, he's keeping the colors very saturated. Even in the background here with church, that same thing is happening where the light side is less saturated than the shadow side.
Yeah.
Okay, let's bring up a couple photographs, and then we can look at those.
Well, it's
and
great seeing these other varying examples as well, though. Again, like you were saying, that so many stylistic choices to make when it comes to flesh. I look at somebody like Brahm, like you mentioned, and one of the things I love most about his work is the way he handles his flesh tones and his shadow colors and stuff. Somebody like John Asaro, completely different, so saturated and overwhelming. But again, it makes the piece.
Yeah, it adds interest and vibrancy. I'm going to bring in 3 photographs that I took. And what we're going to see in these are straight out of my camera. And I tend to, when I photograph, I tend to underexpose, because once the highlights are blown out, it's very hard to get that information back, but we can usually bring a lot of information out of the shadows. Mm-hmm. So I have 3 different flesh types.
Are you shooting in RAW mode or?
I do. I shoot in RAW whenever possible. A couple of these have been converted into JPEG, but that's all right. There's a lot of information here. Yeah. This one was brought in as a RAW file. So what I initially see is, at least for how I like to paint flesh, like on these, the shadows are much too dark. And we can see, kind of the shift in skin tones here. This girl, my friend, is from Nicaragua, and is her ancestry. She's a native Indian in Nicaragua, and she has, as we'll kind of enhance some of the flesh tones, or at least what we can see in Photoshop. You're going to see all of these beautiful colors come out. She was having, I think, a little bit of allergy that night, and her eyes, the whites of her eyes are a little bit red, and her eyes were irritated. But so the whites of her eyes are going to be a little deceptive. So first, I'm going to bring some of that shadow information up, and I'm using the camera raw filter, if you're curious what that is.
So you can do that even on a JPEG, the camera raw control? Okay.
Yeah, you're going to get more data, more information if you use a raw file, because a raw file, rather than being fixed information per pixel, is more of a set of instructions on how to interpret those pixels. But let's kind of do the same thing that we did with that Bouguereau and go in here and look at how much of this is orange and how much is yellow and how much is red. So I'm going to drop the orange down.
Wow.
And look at that. Almost all of her
nose, her cheeks, her chin. Yeah. Still a bit of red and yellow in the forehead, but yeah.
And here's an interesting thing that we can see. Because there is a little bit of yellow left, look how blue this gray looks. If that yellow weren't there, like that, it doesn't look as blue.
Yeah.
But as we push this, we can push that all the way up. Now all of a sudden that looks like it's painted with like blues or violets. So we're seeing the same phenomena in the photograph that we were seeing in Bouguereau's painting as far as flesh goes.
Wow. And can you, you can't eye drop from there, can you? No, that's okay.
Yeah, I don't think we can.
No worries. Now, we're dealing with different things with her slightly darker skin. It looks like her skin is more reflective or so than Bouguereau might paint. Those highlights on the nose, look, there's a lot of contrast from that to the skin around it. Is that, again, a stylistic choice, you think? Or is it having to do with the reflectivity of her skin or the way we photographed her? Or?
there's definitely a lot of variables coming into play, but I think that my experience tells me that with the darker skin tones, the highlights, the skin appears to be more reflective
Hmm.
because we see more contrast, but that the highlights are are fairly consistent from each different skin type in terms of the value that is represented by them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's eye drop the highlight on the Nicaraguan girl's face, and then, for instance, let's see a similar highlight on the Caucasian
Okay.
girl's
And
face.
and I'm going to go ahead and adjust her real quick because as you can
Yeah.
see, still very dark. So let's go
Mhm.
ahead and we'll go back into camera raw filter. Oh, whoops. Um, go into camera raw filter again, and we'll just kind of get her to where, just kind of eyeballing where we think she should be. So I'm going to bring the shadow up. This looks like I underexposed her just a little bit more. I'm going to go, but not blow out any of the highlights.
Yeah.
Okay. So this feels a little closer. Our color temperatures are different. Um, I can, um, let's adjust real quick the color temperatures. So we're a little bit closer. So we'll eyedropper that color. And then I'm going to go in here. We'll compare these.
Ooh,
So
almost the
value
exact
wise,
same value.
they're you can see, look, if we watch over here, you can see that the Caucasian skin is, if there's a margin of error to how I exposed the image, we're probably well within that.
Yeah. So the
So
highlights really aren't changing much. It's just the local color, that mid-tone color, that's going to give the complexion a
that's right.
darker appearance.
So let's do the same thing here. We'll just
You have some great models, by the way.
I've been very lucky to find some really wonderful people to paint. This model, she's has such beautiful skin
Just good
and
eyes too. Yeah.
yeah, and really beautiful eyes. One of the things that I love about her complexion is sometimes you hear about that kind of simplified, more yellow, more red, more cool, kind of the zones of the face.
Yep. Like
And
yellow forehead, red cheeks, blue
right.
chin kind of thing. Yeah.
And in this case, it really is true. Like if we look at the eyedropper here, we're kind of in the orangey
Yeah.
range. And then we come down here and we get more red.
Yeah.
Then we come here and we've gone a little more yellow, but also less
Grayed
saturated.
out. Yeah.
So this great shift
Hmm.
in those planes of the face. She's a lot of fun to paint because of that. And so let's see. So I just adjusted based upon this gray backdrop,
Okay.
her skin tones. Let's grab her highlight.
Is this the same backdrop as we're seeing in the other photos or no?
It is, but unfortunately, we can't totally rely on it because in this case, I have a backlight, as you can
Ah,
see,
gotcha.
and in this case, I have a side light, and in hers, I had no backlight. So we can't totally. All things are not equal.
Yeah. And so did you already do that swatch, that third swatch we're looking at now? Is that the
Yep.
color from her?
So
Wow.
here's the highlight from.
Wow, it hasn't gotten any darker. Okay.
Yeah,
That's good to know.
yeah, they're like all right within the same range. And if let's make those gray,
Oh man.
almost indistinguishable. So those were the highlights on their faces, at least on the nose. But we can see similar things on their forehead. We just see it more because there's a greater level of contrast.
Gotcha. Hmm.
Okay.
This is remarkable, Howard. This is great. So, can we see this in action a little bit? What are you going to do for the rest of us for the demo?
But what I thought we'd do is we'd go over to paint, and then we can talk about the actual pigments that we're using.
Yeah, because this seems, in theory, it's great to look at a Bouguereau and be like, oh, look at all these beautiful, subtle colors. How do we make these colors? Will you go
Right.
over that a little bit for us and show
Yeah,
us?
absolutely. Let's see what we can figure out.
All right, I'm here for part two of our lecture slash demo with Howard Lyon. And Howard, you're going to show us some actual painting techniques, how we can implement what we just spoke about, right?
Yeah, I hopefully will be able to kind of illuminate the things that we looked at and discovered while we were looking at the digital images with some actual paint. And I wanted to show you some of the things that I've done recently for my own sake, like things that I've done to study and learn, study Bouguereau, study from life, study from photography, and bring a lot of that knowledge together. And so I've been doing these tiny little paintings.
How big are these, would you say?
And these are, there's my hand for scale. I think it's like 3.5 by 4 inches or 3 inches by 3.5 inches.
So that eye is just barely larger than life size then.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Just a little bit larger than life, which is fun because you can get in there and paint some of the detail without actually getting very detailed.
Yeah.
So it's a nice way to work.
You
You
mentioned
can see
that you did
Yeah, go ahead.
these little studies and all this stuff. You also mentioned that you've been painting every Wednesday for 2 years. And when you say you've been painting from life every Wednesday, you mean every Wednesday for like a year and a half now. You are really good about doing practice pieces, I think, and staying sharp and actually doing deliberate practice. Do you think this is where you're making most of your real leaps for your actual painting process?
Most definitely. I think looking back over my career as a professional, painting from life every Wednesday consistently has done more to improve my abilities than any other thing that I've done.
Wow.
I'm amazed at when I start working from photography now, how I'm much more deliberate in my color mixing, in my color selection than I was even from just a couple years ago. So I'm hoping that continues. I really have tried to make it not optional. And it's been interesting from just a practical standpoint. That's been a real commitment from not just me, but also like my family. Shari's helped me. My wife has helped me kind of stick with that. And we've planned around it, said this is an important activity during the week to maintain, and it's paid off. Of like the last year, we've only missed probably 5 or 6 weeks out of the year where we didn't hold the painting session. So
Wow. Fantastic. I tried to pick it up. I have a new assistant, so we've been spending Sundays painting from life or painting
good.
mannequin heads from life. And even just 3 or 4 weeks of that, it's amazing at how much my painting chops have gotten better. That I paint much looser, I paint much larger, I'm painting on different materials, but things that it's like, oh, I forgot that I need to do this stuff. If I want to learn, I have to do something different more than anything.
Right. I think that's key too, is doing something different, because I think when we do the same thing over and over, it becomes narrowing. Like we eliminate things, and our range of what we see and do becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. But by altering that, it forces us to broaden as we look for solutions and look for new ways of doing things. And painting from life, fortunately, is always new.
Yeah.
Like no matter what the situation is, you could do the same lighting with the same model, and you just move a few inches to one side or the other, and it's a completely new problem to try and tackle.
Now, these eyes we're looking at here, these weren't done from life, were they?
These were not. No, these were done from photography shortly after painting from life. So it would be like painting on Thursday morning, and trying to implement some of the things like taking notes and looking at the studies that I had done. One of the things that I liked that came through in this is if you look how kind of peachy orange the shadow is underneath her eye. That's because the model in the picture was wearing a white shirt, and
Ah.
it was bouncing up some real orange light here and here. Um, and that was an observation made from life.
And now it
So
looks like
I've
you're
got a
painting these kind of in the same approach you would for life painting. You're not doing an underdrawing here or anything, are you?
No, that's right. I just started with like a little oil sketch, kind of marking them out. In fact, I think I have some videos of these up on my Instagram of all three of these. I'll bring up a little bit more. Dan, you might actually recognize this eye.
Uh,
Um,
oh, I think I do. Is this my model from my
yes,
Poltergeist cover? Like she was,
yes.
yeah, oh, wow. That's funny. I do recognize
So
her eyes.
yeah, so Dan came out and taught a workshop in my studio and had some just beautiful reference. And this model of yours has wonderful eyes. And so I just did an eye study.
Yeah, this is the girl with like
Um,
kind of curly brown hair a little bit.
yeah,
Is that? Oh,
he
yeah.
looks really kind of fierce,
Yeah.
like she's got a cool look. It's amazing how like identifiable eyes are,
Hmm.
because this model, her mom knew her immediately when I
Yeah.
posted this, even without tagging her. It's like, oh yeah, that's my daughter. Um, so there's so much to be seen in there. I'm going to scoot these over real quick
You
and
have an
bring up these
incredible
next.
easel, Howard.
Yeah,
We've talked about this, but I'm sure people watching this video right now are like, what is going on? This is a whole wall-mounted easel you have that holds like multiple paintings, right?
yeah. I've been very lucky. Like the uprights just slide left and right, and as you'll see, like I can just, it's all motorized too. So I can just lower the whole thing down. The camera's not moving, the easel's moving. And so what I'll do with these little studies is I'll paint from the photograph and kind of get the drawing and get the elements that I want. But then I put the photograph away and I just start inventing the color based upon what I know from life, know from doing the life painting. And it allows me to kind of escape the chains of the photograph. I find sometimes the photograph is so powerful as an image itself that if I have it sitting there next to me the whole time, that I just get locked into it.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
you start scrutinizing the photo, trying to match that as opposed to what the
right.
photo was trying to match, which is essentially the person. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's much better to, you're able to put much more artistry, much more creativity into the image if you just put the photograph away and trust yourself, trust in what you understand about light and color and skin.
Now, I know quite a few illustrators, Boris Vallejo and Julie Bell, for example, that work from black and white reference or maybe sepia
Right.
toned reference so that they have to make up their colors. And you look at, say, Boris's painting, it's got so much color. He's actually using, unlike Bouguereau, he's using viridian green and alizarin and
Right.
yellow. There's so much color in his flesh, but he's just making it up essentially from what he's used to seeing. Do you
It's a
ever
great,
do black and white photography?
I do. I've found that sometimes if I'm still struggling with the drawing, but I feel like my color is being contaminated by the photo, I'll convert it to black and white. And there's some cool things that you can do by converting it to black and white. In Photoshop, if you don't just drop the saturation down, but go in and make adjustments using the black and white conversion tool, and it will let you convert it to black and white using different filters to bring out higher contrast or less contrast depending upon the colors that are being converted. And I find that I get a better, more luminous flesh range doing that than if I just drop the saturation down.
Gotcha.
So those are a couple studies, just examples of what I might do in order to further my understanding and knowledge. And the great thing about them too is that you can then sell them.
Yeah.
So what we've got here is I just did a quick transfer from a photo so that we can do a little bit of painting and explore some color. But before we do that, we'll see what we get to time-wise. We don't want this to be a a 10-hour video.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm sure some of us do.
Yeah.
But I think, that first one, this isn't really a portrait painting demo. This is a flesh painting demo.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So we just want to explore painting flesh and even a little bit about how I block in the flesh so that I can hopefully maintain the value relationships as I'm painting, because it makes a difference for me if I paint from dark to light or light to dark, or establish the middle value and then work out from there. And so we'll look a little bit at that.
great.
So what I thought we might do, and hopefully we can do these fairly quick. I say hopefully because I've never done this before, where I painted like a little sphere of flesh. At least not as a demo.
Yeah.
So we'll see how it goes. Okay, so here's my palette. By the way, I use a New Wave palette, which I really love. It has great ergonomics, nice to use. And even when I'm sitting at my easel, I like it quite a bit.
Great.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's so many colors on here, and I do much the same. I have a lot of colors on my palette. Is this palette, or do you have the colors on your palette that somebody, an old master like Bouguereau, would have used on his?
That's a good question. I know that some of the colors overlap, and I can't. We don't know exactly what Bouguereau would have on his palette at any given time. What we know are the colors that he had in his studio when he died. At least that's what I've been able to find from it. But he would use a flake white, and he did have access to cadmiums, and would use a madder, which is going to be similar to alizarin crimson. Had a few different blues that were listed, but I find that the colors that I have here give me a pretty good range.
Now, I know a lot of artists that use a limited palette, especially when starting off, like a Zorn palette, which is just, say, 4 colors or so. And one of the benefits of that limited palette is it kind of forces you to be really conscientious about those things we were talking about, hue shifts and saturation shifts. Do you think you could do a painting like what you showed us with a Zorn palette?
I do. Kind of one of the things that we saw as we were looking at the digital is that most of the color was orange.
Yeah.
In that if you have a strong red and a strong yellow and black, that there's so much that you can do with that in terms of creating a variety of flesh tones. So,
okay, cool. So we don't need all these colors we've got here. It's nice to have them, but
that's right. Okay. And this is my palette that I use when I'm painting landscape or painting, full illustration. It's just always on my palette. But in this case, I've got titanium white. I do add flake white to my palette, and that's what I like to paint in when I'm going to paint in layers. But if I'm doing just a direct painting, titanium is often nicer because it has more opacity. And so I can hit opaque passages with it, whereas flake is semi-transparent, so you don't get that opacity. I have cad yellow, or cad lemon yellow, and cad yellow light, cad orange, vermilion, which is a little bit peachier than cad red light, but if you just had cad red light, you'd be fine. And then I have cad red, which mixes much cooler when it mixes with white than cad red light or vermilion. Alizarin crimson, yellow ochre, light red, transparent red oxide, raw sienna, ivory black, phthalo green, viridian, cobalt blue, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue. And then these are just a couple colors that were left over from a painting I was doing.
I always have my weirdo colors I stick in the other spot. The
Jacksonine purple.
The light red. Is that light red oxide? What is that? I'm unfamiliar with that.
It's like English red, but at least in my tube, it's just light red. But it is an oxide. So other brands might list it as light red oxide because it's one of the iron oxides.
And what are we looking at for the medium you have there, that sort of alkyd gel stuff?
So that's exactly it. It's a Galkid gel that just comes in tubes, and I don't use a lot of medium when I paint, but there are cases where I need a little bit to thin things. Maybe when I do the initial sketching or that, it can come in handy. Um,
Now
but I find that fresh paint usually works great.
we're going to talk a little bit about mixing colors because I feel like actually mixing colors is really difficult for a lot of people. But
Right.
the colors we're mixing, this would apply to. Do you use the same theory when you work digitally as well? The same shifting to more saturated and darker kind of thing?
I do. I didn't used to. Um, but as I started painting more, I found that it effective. As I started painting more traditionally and studying traditionally, it affected my digital work to the point where I try and approach my digital paintings exactly the same way that I do my traditional.
So any of our digital viewers could still apply what we're going to see here to their work as well.
For sure,
Okay.
100%,
Okay.
100%. So maybe what I'll do, if we'll see if this is effective. I wasn't planning on this, but I'll show like um, when I'm just getting started, um, I put a little bit of color in and um, kind of make my orange, and so that's cad yellow and it's vermilion. Vermilion's so powerful that it will take over your mixtures really quick. So I'm gonna mix up a flesh color using the highest chroma colors at first, and then I'll mix up a flesh color using some lower chroma colors, and we can kind of compare those.
Cool.
So what I'm gonna do
And do you
is
already have in mind the complexion of flesh? Are we going for a light colored person or a
I
dark colored
do
person or?
for this initial one, we're gonna go with more of a Caucasian, a light color, because I've got the reference up out of camera right now of the Caucasian model that I had up on my screen in Photoshop. So it's the same one that we saw earlier.
Do you find one type of complexion to be more difficult or easier than another type? Is one more subtle than another?
I struggle a little bit more with the African range of flesh because I haven't painted it as much. Uh, and that's my own fault of not having enough models that have African heritage, African ethnicity. Being in the Southwest, um, just as a percentage of models, it's a little bit harder to find. Um, but
It's
I
funny. I've
found,
always
as you
found
saw,
the opposite. I've always found it easier to paint dark skinned people personally. I
oh
feel
yeah,
like there's
really,
so much more color, and you can't really go because their skin is so reflective that there's almost always an excuse for that color. Like, just glop it in there and it's fine. I
right.
find I have to be less subtle somehow with dark skin.
What I guess I struggle with is when it's that beautiful skin tone that has a little more of the ash color in it,
Hmm.
where it gets cooler
Yeah.
around the mouth and chin, and just getting those establishing those color relationships. I find I fight with it a little bit more. I've had a couple models that have come to sit for my class, and I kept hiring them to come back for the next week because I didn't quite get it, and had them come again. So just kind of sticking with it. So what I've done here is I mixed up a mixture of, I had a little bit of this still in my brush, but this is ivory black with titanium white. And I mixed up a kind of a grayish color of a similar value that I can then mix in here.
So we're trying
And
to
then I can
emulate what
adjust
we
from
saw
that.
in Photoshop. So the orange we have is what would have been in the top right corner, and we're trying to gray it out a little bit so we can
That's
drop
right.
its saturation. Okay.
So this is right here. I feel like I'm starting to get some decent flesh tone. And this is um, titanium white, cad yellow, and vermilion or cad red light, very similar in color, and ivory black.
Okay.
So it's effectively Zorn
It's
at that
basically
point.
just orange and gray. Orange, black, and
That's
white,
right.
right? Okay.
That's right. So my palette might drop in and out of view here for a little bit while I clean a brush occasionally.
And because you've mixed your own orange through yellow and red, we can shift that hue rather easily back and forth.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very, those are such powerful colors, the cad yellow and the vermilion, that we can just jump back and forth. So what I'm going to do real quick, I'm going to get a real clean brush, and I'm going to mix up pure gray with ivory, or not, it won't be pure gray, but it will be gray with ivory black, which is going to be a cooler gray, just so that we can see it in comparison.
Wow. Yeah.
So the range of colors that we can get with just those, really the three colors in white, is pretty remarkable. In where, to my eye, I'm already seeing a lot of those Bouguereau flesh colors right there. Just changing the saturation, changing the mixture of red with black, red with yellow. So lots of possibilities. So I don't know how practical it will be to keep my palette up, but occasionally I'll raise it up.
Yeah, if we have any questions, I'll have you just slide it back in.
So what I'm going to do is, I was going to mix up.
Should we talk about the ground a little bit? You're painting on a gray.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. This gray, I actually did it because we had talked about it. Dan and I were at a LuxCon, and they were doing a demo from a studio in Caminati was there. And I can't remember the artist that was painting. Do you remember, Dan, that we were asking that question?
I'll try to remember later, but I'm blanking. I remember, I think, I remember certain letters from the name, but they're not even in order.
That's great. I remember what he looked like.
Yeah.
But he was painting on a gray tone, and so it just got me thinking about it. Sometimes I'll paint on gray. Sometimes I'll tone it with ivory black.
Is it Early or Daily or something like that?
Early, Stephen Early?
Yeah, that sounds right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And the nice thing about the gray is it gives you kind of a barometer in which to compare the temperatures of the colors that you add very easily. And so as you start to add flesh tones, you can quickly tell how saturated your color is in relation to the gray that's there, and then in relation to the other colors that you put down around it.
So you're just trying to mix a very neutral gray, not too warm, not too cool, not too light, not too dark.
Exactly. And so this is golden values number 6, neutral gray. So if you wanted an easy color to put down and paint on top of that is useful, that's a good one to put down. But sometimes I'll tone my canvas with more of a pink color, and sometimes I'll tone it with more of a peachy color or a yellow, and they all have different effects.
And does it actually affect the flesh tones that come out of it? Does it show through in the end?
It does if you aren't, it does when you paint kind of thin, or if you're painting with flake white, you'll see those colors come through. So if you paint very thick and very opaque, you can obliterate the color of the ground for sure. But I think a lot of the subtlety and interest comes in having some semi-transparent layers or some thinner layers next to some thicker layers, in which case you get a little bit of that coming through, and it's very effective. It creates a richness and a depth that is hard to get any other way. So I was going to mix right next to it a little mixture with the light red, and we'll do some raw sienna, just so that you can see, like, using other colors. Like if you were to shift your whole palette, if you wanted to limit it to just the 3 colors, you could shift the whole thing to a different red and a different yellow.
So we could use yellow ochre and transparent red oxide instead and still have the same relationships.
Yeah, that's right.
Is there a specific reason you don't keep burnt sienna on your palette, I noticed?
I switched from burnt sienna to transparent red oxide. And there's 2 reasons. One, I like this color is a little bit richer and mixes nicer with white to my eye, in my opinion. And it stays wet for weeks on your palette.
Yeah.
Whereas burnt sienna, you squeeze out new paint every day.
Yeah.
And so it
The
just
transparency
became,
doesn't bother you about that, though?
it doesn't, I mean, burnt sienna is kind of transparent as well. The transparent red oxide is definitely more transparent,
Yeah.
but it works pretty well. So
I use that color on my palette as well. Stephen Assail is a big fan of that color, and when I studied under
yeah,
him, he got me hooked on it. So
yeah, it's a good color. So you can see I can kind of creep up onto the same color. So this is mixing with the lower chroma, lower value, but getting almost the exact same color is working with the higher
yeah, and it
chroma.
looks like we've got yellows, reds, greens, blues, purples. It looks like we have everything
Right.
there, and really, it's just been variations of red, yellow, and black, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Exactly. So it's amazing the way we see color, the way color is produced with oils is continues to amaze me. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just paint some little like eggheads that I think will that we can talk about color and shadow and light and how the form turns, and so we'll do them kind of small, and maybe we can fit several on here. We'll do a few. So, and this isn't too dissimilar to how I would start on a portrait as well.
On a portrait, I assume you'd have a pretty solid drawing underneath, right?
So a lot of times, and I'll just kind of sketch in real quick just to give you an idea. I'm mixing color right now. What I'll do is, like, if this were a head, a lot of times I'll just go in and measure out and kind of sketch in like this where the light and dark side is.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so when you say portrait, you're still implying a portrait from life. This is fairly similar to how you would do it? Okay.
Yeah, portrait from life. And I've found that even sometimes when I'm painting from photography, that rather than do a detailed drawing underneath, it is very rewarding to start it like this, where I'm looking for the big shapes first, rather than looking for line.
Yeah.
And then go from there.
Not to slow you down here, Howard. So the colors we're looking at right now are literally the ones you just mixed on your palette?
Yes.
Can you show us which, because they look so different on the gray now. I'm having a hard time.
I did mix a darker color.
Okay.
So this is my shadow, but I was using, this color is mixed with raw sienna and light red and ivory black.
Okay, still yellow,
so
reds,
it was
and
the
blacks.
same colors. Okay. Yep.
And the
yep.
highlight color that we're looking at, that's the first sort of light yellow one you mixed up?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah.
Cool.
So for the whole demo, that's all I will use.
Okay.
Are those colors. So I'll keep the color selection boring, but hopefully create interesting colors from them.
Great.
Okay, so once I've started the painting and I have a little bit of that color blocked in, there's a couple directions I might take it. One is to take the shadow mixture that I have and identify the areas where there might be a little more red in it, and I will go ahead and indicate that. So like in the shadow. So see how I just dropped a little more red right in there. And then in the...
And now, why would there be more red there? Because the cheeks are more red, or because it's reflecting something else, or?
Both.
Okay.
Both. You get, as that plane turns, depending on what is around it, often we will get reflection off of a shoulder or the trapezius or a shirt. If someone's wearing a blue shirt, it'll change that color a bit that's reflecting in. Portrait painters also will talk about that you should wear black when you paint people's portraits, because the color of your shirt will reflect into your portrait, and it will reflect into the person if they're close enough.
Wow.
So that's kind of interesting. Yeah. I've heard that tip on a few different occasions, and it makes sense. Right now, I'm wearing kind of a neutral gray shirt that I wear often when I paint. If I'm not wearing that, I usually wear a black shirt. But if I wear a bright, like a light blue shirt or something, I definitely notice it in my painting.
Oh, wow.
So I've got the shadow color, so I added a little bit more warmth there. I'm going to cool it down right here. And there's, since we're just making this up, I'm not going to get too specific with it, but that shadow underneath the lip usually tends to be kind of cool right there on the chin. And then since we're stylizing a bit, I'm going to take my same shadow color and I'm going to add some yellow to it and a little bit more gray. And I'm going to use that up on the forehead. So I'll put that in. I got a little bit too light there, but we'll make adjustments as we go. All right, so now I'm going to mix up. I'm going to start transitioning into the lighter side right here. And I'm painting kind of thin. I should probably mix up a bit more paint. I was using the piles that we had there. I'm going to mix up some more so that I'm not
Remixing
painting
color
too
constantly.
thin.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's something that I've found too. Is I've painted more from life. Is I'm far more successful when I have a substantial amount of paint out and a substantial mixed up. If I'm just scraping the paint off of the palette and scraping the paint back onto my canvas, it's much harder to get something that's pleasing. It's harder to get nice marks working that way too.
Yeah, plus to achieve that level of subtlety we were looking at in the Bouguereau, if you're scrounging for scraps of a certain color, you're obviously not being subtle enough.
I always think of in Lord of the Rings when Bilbo says he feels like butter scraped over so much toast.
Yeah.
I that always comes to mind when I'm being skimpy with my paint. Like, oh, I need to be more generous and not scrape the butter over so much toast. So it's just very quickly, I'm keeping these mixtures fairly gray on my palette.
Mm-hmm. Now you're thinking of a somewhat neutral colored light source. This isn't specifically like a candle light or a moonlight or anything like that. We're just kind of going for a white light on a face.
That's right. In fact, I happen to know the temperature of the light because of the flashes that I used. Mm-hmm. So it's a 5,600 degree light that these were photographed under, which is a little bit warmer than noonday sun. Noonday sun tends to be like around 6,600, 6,500. A lot of flashes are around that 5,800 to 6,500 degree. And if you're not familiar with light temperature, that's something that you can just Google. And it's important to know and understand that in order to get good white balance on your photographs. That's a whole nother discussion, but all right, a small adjustment. I'm going to paint in some black and white on here. And what we're hoping is that it will help the camera maintain a little more consistent exposure, but also it'll be a good reference for you guys to see just value-wise. So we'll see the fun challenges of filming and trying to get accurate color. So, okay, so back to the piece. So I'm going to block in real quick the color on the cheeks. So we're going to shift it a little bit more to red as compared to the yellow that we had up on the forehead. And right now, I'm not worried too much about all the little distinctions of form. And this is, when I paint from life, I do the same thing. where I reduce it down really to two values as much as possible. I did a little bit of that in the forehead, turning it, but as much as possible, I try and keep it just at a couple values, but I will account for color shifts and saturation shifts within the shadow and within the light. So in this case, we've got a little shift from yellow to red, and then we're going to cool things, gray things down a little bit here.
So those color field shifts apply to both the light area and the shadow area?
They do. Now, and
that
can change depending upon the circumstances. Like I said, the color of the shirt that someone was wearing might have a big impact on it. But
yeah, or if we're doing a sci-fi painting, it might be dramatically shifted.
Yeah, and as we talked when we were looking at the digital, there really aren't rules as much as to what colors you choose. If there are rules, it applies to the color relationships, not the actual colors. So we cooled things off just a little bit in through here.
That's great. And there's already a tremendous sense of form on this already. Is this typical, or do you usually try to achieve a sense of form before you start getting into details?
For sure. In fact, the other night when I was doing some of the portrait painting, I kept it just in my head, form, and made myself just establish form for the first hour of a 3-hour session.
Wow.
To not even do any detailing until I felt like I really was turning the form appropriately, It was very effective. It was a good exercise to do because a couple weeks previous, I felt like I wasn't getting the form the way I wanted it to. So I'm like, all right, this is going to be my focus, until I feel like I make some headway there. So I'm mixing up just a little bit for the mouth. One of the nice things about using
that red just keyed everything. That's great.
Yeah, it's nice using this limited palette because your colors tend to be fairly harmonious, right? Right out of the gate.
I feel like it also alleviates so much doubt. There's only so many options it can be. You need it more red or more yellow. You need it more gray or less gray. You need a lighter or darker.
Right.
It's not like, well, maybe I don't have the right color. Maybe I need to squeeze something out on my tube. The answer is there somewhere, and it's only like one of 16 options or something.
Right. Yeah. If it needs to be more yellow, well, then it's easy. Yeah. Add more yellow.
Yeah.
But what's funny about that, it sounds almost ridiculous to put it in those real simple terms. But what's funny about that is that really is still the case even when you have 20 colors on your palette. Mm-hmm. It's just deciding, okay, it needs to be more yellow, but I need it to be an orangey yellow or a green yellow, and still trying to make yourself approach it simplistically, and not get too complex with this in terms of mixing the color. I think that oils, they offer so many colors that we make it more complicated than it needs to be. Well, what's that? He has a YouTube channel, Draw Mix Paint, I think is the name of it.
Oh, yeah.
And he does everything with a set of primaries,
Yeah. Is that Carter, maybe? Like CARD, I think. I should know. He's actually sent me some of his paint before to use, too.
Oh, cool. Yeah, he mixes medium right into the paint, doesn't he?
Yeah.
It's very fluid. So I increased the saturation under the nose a little bit because I'm making the assumption that we're getting light bouncing up in there. It's the same reason that the shadows under the eyes are still have some saturation in there. Um,
And the red in the lips, was that just the vermilion that you had pointed us to before? Kind of
that's
straight for
right.
the upper lip? Okay.
Yep. From actually, so I'll do a little bit more detail with that because that was vermilion with ivory black. So
Oh,
I'm going to add some pure vermilion so that you can see what that might look like because we actually get
oh,
some real intensity of color underneath the lip right at the edge of the shadow. So I don't know if that's reading on the
yeah.
video or
It's
not,
yep, absolutely. At least on my end.
but I'm gonna take now ivory black and vermilion. It'll be heavily influenced by the vermilion, and we're gonna hit the corners of the mouth. So just a little bit of that color in there and that cast shadow. It looks like on my camera that it's showing maybe a little bit darker
Oh,
than
it's
what I'm
actually
seeing in person here.
uh that
Maybe not.
color, maybe not. In general, we're a little overexposed here. The whites are
A
a little
little light.
blown out.
Okay.
Yeah, when your hand goes in, it exposes a little better for us, but that's okay. I can
Oh
maybe,
yeah.
yeah.
And then I'll do the nostrils too with that same color, but compare that color to black.
Yeah.
It's
No.
not a super dark color.
It's still, its value is maybe what, like 70%?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's probably a good point. And then where we get the hairs growing underneath the skin, under the eyebrows, like transitioning into the eyebrows, it tends to cool the area around it.
It's incredible how
Those
much
in.
form there already is here. It's I mean it's obviously a face and it's obviously flesh and it doesn't seem to be that much work. It happens relatively easily.
in just trying to be deliberate both with the colors that I mix. I got a little bit light there. The colors that I mix and the strokes, not fiddling with it too much. Block that in. And then once I get it to this point, that's when I start to put in some of the transitions. So as the form, just subtle little things as the form is going to turn over that cheek. We're going to have a fall off on the light as the cheekbone turns away from the light source. And as I do, I'm going to drop the saturation from this color as it moves over. I'm going to start dropping the saturation down too. So the reason I like breaking it down into kind of stages like this, like establishing shape and the color temperatures and the shadows that way, and then moving into creating the transitions. And this is all before painting detail. I'm still looking at the shapes that are in front of me. Is that it simplifies it. I don't have to swallow everything at the same time. It 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 allows me to think of it in components rather than digest it all. And my hope is as I get better, as I do it more, that I'll be able to take bigger bites. I'll be able to tackle more of the problem at the same time.
Oh man, this hair. I just love when you put down something like so different that it just keys everything else. That all of a sudden you can see those relationships just come to life.
Right? The values, the colors.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those eye sockets looked really severe before, but now that we see the dark of the hair, it's like, oh, they're really not that dark. They're really.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to try and make this very pretty. We'll just
Oh, that's okay.
we'll
No,
just push it far enough
I think
to.
I'd much rather see you. This is more than, at a certain point, it's just you finessing details, but most of the color
It's true.
relationships
Yeah.
are still there. And
So
again, this
in
is a flesh painting demo, not a head painting demo. So we're
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
I
and
wouldn't
I'm
mind seeing a
still
little of the shadow under the neck if you get to it later, though, just to see
okay.
how it
Yeah,
affects
yeah.
things.
No, that'll be good to do. And when I'll jump into that now. It sometimes sometimes we see that beautiful reflected light up in the neck, especially depending on what color clothes someone's wearing. Um, but I usually try and resist painting that right away until I've got all of my value relationships established, because inevitably I paint it far too strong
Hmm.
than it actually is, and that is certainly experience based, but I also think it speaks to how we see value. Um, I was reading that we're capable of seeing about 1,000 different separations in value, but we can see like over 100,000 values. We just can only see about 1,000 at a time.
Ah,
And so if you go into a dark lit area, you can see a big range of values. But if you go into an area where the sun is shining and you've got black shadows in that same area, you're limited as to the subtlety that you can see in that scenario. Let's see. I'm a little bit lighter than I want to be right there, so I add a little more ivory black. But then I add a little more yellow because I want to maintain my saturation. I don't want to get, as we saw in the shadows, I don't want to let my shadows get desaturated. When people paint flesh and they get those real muddy colors in the flesh, it's usually because the values are on, but the saturations are off.
yeah. I love watching how deliberate you are with your brush making. That even though this seems like a simple process, that it's not necessarily a fast or sloppy one. Not to be, it's still
Yeah,
very, very deliberate.
that's good to hear because that's that's an acquired skill, I should say, or trait that I've been focusing on.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest issues I think with a lot of painters is that you make a mark and too many times you don't question it and people just keep making marks like for no reason really, like quite literally for no reason,
Right.
without knowing what they were trying to achieve with that mark except that it was something different, you know.
Right, exactly. And I that's exactly what I used to do. I just like it was almost like I was hoping that if I made enough marks, eventually it would look good.
Yeah, yeah.
So in blocking in the neck, I'm still kind of keeping my um, two value, the shapes set up that way. I'm gonna knock in the ear real quick too.
Yeah.
Let's see. A little bit too orange, a little bit too yellow, I should say, since I don't have orange that I'm using. I'll stick to we're going to cut right into that black a little bit. So in order to paint over wet colors, because I get asked that too, how do you paint wet in a wet? People will struggle with that with oils. You notice I made one brush stroke and then I didn't fiddle with it at all.
Yeah.
Um, and then you can paint wet right over wet.
I think it also, there's a lot to do with paint consistency as well. Your
Yeah,
paint is relatively sticky and stiff right now, I assume, right?
it is. There's very little medium
Yeah, it's
that's
not
in the paint.
dripping and slippery with oil, which I find is just,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, a disaster when it comes to mixing if it's too slippery.
Right. Yeah, adding in like pure linseed oil has its place, but it can sure make it tricky to paint with. This color right here is often super intense where the earlobe hits the face. So and sometimes like I'm keeping my brush, it's not big, it's not tiny though, it's not a little detailed brush. So what you can do if that shape is too large, you paint the color in and then come back in right on top of it and make it smaller by painting the value on top of it. So like I took that shape and made it small just
Mm-hmm.
by painting over it. So
This looks great, Howard. Before we get too carried away on this one, should we kind of wrap this one up and try another approach with a different complexion?
yeah, I'll hit the reflected light under the neck since I
Okay,
specifically
great.
talked
Actually, man,
about that,
every
and then we'll
every
move on.
bit you add, keep doing your thing because every time you add a new stroke, it just keeps getting better and better. It's also helping the relationship, so I feel like it is relevant. But yeah, those darks around the face, they're changing the appearance of everything.
Changes a lot, and then you get things like just like just like we do in the flesh, in the hair, as it gets more light, it desaturates too. So add those brighter highlights, but don't add chroma so that it stays light. Let's see. Okay, let's put in, I'm going to emphasize the core shadow on the jaw just a little bit, and then that will give us the information we need to do the reflected light down there. Not quite dark enough. Now, I've been jumping around a little bit on my palette, or I mean on my painting. But if you can make yourself, and this is something that I struggle with, is if you watch my time lapses, you really see it, is I jump around a lot on my painting. And I don't think that that is inherently bad. But one of the advantages of working from one area to the next is that you can do the same thing on your palette and you can judge those relationships in temperature and color easily because they're right on your palette and then you're painting them next to each other on your painting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So
I think I do a lot of jumping around as well, mostly because I'm just trying to use what's on my brush. Just
yeah,
yeah,
right. You're like, oh, I've got this. I can use it here.
yeah.
And I know what you mean. Sargent gave like just a few points of advice on painting, and one of them was don't jump around. He worded it better than that, but that was essentially what it was. He said paint connected areas
Oh,
in your
smart.
work. So let's see. Okay, I got a little bit distracted. And we get a really nice higher chroma red right here, that transition. And then, oh man, I just keep seeing more that I want to put in. But we'll jump off. She's got these beautiful beautiful grays right underneath the eye that add so much. Um, all right. How are we looking at time?
Oh, you're good. You can go as
Okay.
long as you want, honestly. So
Okay.
do whatever you feel most relevant.
Okay. All right. We'll try and do a couple of these little things. And you know that there's always that saying, um, grab a brush and then grab one
One
a
size
couple
bigger.
sizes bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. To stay big, but really grab the right sized brush.
Yeah. The right
Whatever that
sized
is.
one is usually, yeah, a little bigger than most people think it is. But yeah,
Yeah.
I find it forces me
Yeah,
to think in generalities.
right. And so, I could keep working with this brush and really get a lot of the information that we need, but it's large enough that kind of how I judge whether a brush is large enough for the job that I'm doing is if there's a plane of the face that I'm wanting to paint and the whole thing is the same value and color, can I paint it in one brush stroke with the brush that I'm using?
Hmm.
And if it's not, then there's a good chance that I would benefit from going to a larger brush.
No, that's a good way to think of it.
In this case, most of the planes are about the size or smaller of my brush head. Um, it might we might run into just a little bit right here on the forehead, but other than that, everything is small enough. In some of the classical ateliers that are going on right now, they do these little posterized studies as they're getting ready to do a portrait or larger. There's a lot of benefit to doing them.
Yeah, actually, I was mentioning I've been life painting on Sundays. Our last Sunday was spent just doing multiple little head studies of 30 minutes each.
Ah, that's really cool.
Yeah, just taking a mannequin head, and we did Halloween shaped mannequin heads too. So some were
Oh, no
Frankenstein
way.
and stuff.
That's
Yeah,
really cool.
which are great. Yeah.
That's really cool. Yep, I need to get out there and paint with you.
Oh, it'd be
It'll be
fantastic.
really fun. So everyone that listens and watches this, let's pick a place and we'll all meet up and we'll paint together.
I do keep thinking about doing that. I used to organize this artist retreat trip, and we started doing it before IMC was a thing, before IlluxCon or Spectrum or
Yeah,
anything. So it was nice to have a retreat to meet everybody at, but it seems like there's
yeah,
less of a need for it now. But it really is, getting to work with your peers and not have to be like, at a convention when you see them is fantastic.
right. It really is. I was, I don't tend to, as you know, I don't tend to get out to a lot of events, but I'm trying to be better about that. And just going to a LuxCon this last, uh, a month or month and a half ago
Yeah.
was just reminded me how valuable that is.
Yeah.
You guys have a great lineup for IMC this year. I'm always jealous when that
Oh,
comes around.
yeah, I
I think
know.
I need to
Ken
get out there
Williams.
again. That's amazing.
I'm really quite stoked about that. We're off topic a little bit, but I was probably in college, maybe a freshman or sophomore, probably in like end of freshman year. And I had been attending functions of the Society of Illustrators quite a bit. I had received, I think to date, I'm the youngest member they've ever had.
Yeah, that's
They made a student membership thing so that I could kind of, my mentor was the president at the time, so it was kind of an honorary type thing. But I would hang out there all the time. And one year Ken Williams came in. I think he flew in for an award maybe or something, and he was there the day before early, just kind of having lunch, and I just chatted his ear off. And
That's so great.
with every, like, he was already very well established at this time, and he's quite a bit older than I am. And I asked every quintessentially annoying question you could think of, like, what kind of brush do you use? What kind of varnish do you
Right.
use? What kind of, like, as if that was going to make me better. And the poor guy was trying to eat his lunch, and I'm just pestering him with questions. And he was like, you know what, just send me your address, and I'll send you some stuff when I get back home. And I did. I wrote down my address for him, thinking I'd never hear from him again. And like a month later, he sent a care package to my apartment full of catalogs and books from his
Oh,
shows
wow.
and all this stuff. Just so nice and so sweet. And I don't know if he knows how influential that was to me as a young artist. Just, finally, like, yeah, actually, meeting one of your heroes and them still
Right.
being welcoming and inviting with their information. It was fantastic.
That's so good to hear. I know when I was 12, I met an artist that, his name's Greg Olson, who was just so kind, and he talked to me like I was his equal.
Hmm.
Like, oh, you're an artist? Okay, let's talk. I mean, um, it was very cool. It made me believe 100%. This is what I'm going to do.
Huh.
you know, he thinks I'm an artist too. Then I must be an artist. It had a huge impact, and
Oh,
so I
that's
try
neat.
and keep that in mind. Okay, so I feel like that established the form pretty
That
well.
looks great, Howard. When I blur my eyes at this, it works. It, like, no amount of detail is going to change the sense of form there. That's
Yeah, it's kind of there. So let's switch over, and
that's great.
we'll do a different one.
Our exposure looks a little better there too, actually. I know we moved it over
Oh,
to help
good,
with focus, but should help.
good.
So
So I'm going to clean my palette off.
actually,
I'll
can we
show you
take
that's kind of what.
let's look at the
Yeah.
mess we started with and what we've got now. So this got even more gray. So we started off with some pretty different colors. I still see them there. Some very greenish, some yellow, some red, some purpley, but it's all kind of homogenized as we've gone along and gotten even grayer
Yeah.
than when it started.
Right. Is I A lot of those grays came from working into the light side, graying them, and then as I cooled down, going down into the neck, they got a lot grayer too.
Wonderful. That looks great. Do we have time? Maybe we only have time for two of these. Do we want to try some really dark skin or in between? And then we'll kind
Let's
of.
see. I've got the model from Ghana, and I have the model from Nicaragua. Which one would you like me to go for?
I think we'll probably bump into a lot more interesting things with the black girl, the girl from Ghana.
Okay, cool. Cool. All right, I'm
I mean,
gonna
essentially,
clean
it's
all
the
those.
same principles we're applying to both. So, right?
Yeah,
It's
it is. And like we saw, it's really the same range of colors. Just the values are pushed down a bit.
yeah. Maybe if
In
we have
some,
time, we'll do a super crude one. Maybe in a weird light source color or something
oh, cool.
at the
Yeah,
end.
yeah,
Cool.
that'd be cool, and we can see what I can make up right on the spot.
That's always exciting.
Yeah,
Nothing like a little adrenaline, get some fear
that's
going
right.
for your demo.
Ah. So, and when I block in, we'll do it about the same size, but this is usually how I approach it as well.
Now, when you say this is how you normally approach it, this is when you're approaching a life painting. If you're doing an illustration, would you still draw this loose?
No, I do, because with an illustration, usually I need the imagery to be approved by the client. So I've done a much more detailed drawing. Um, and then because I've done that work, I'll transfer it over. And I don't want to surprise the client at the end.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, usually with an illustration, it's more established. But I'd love to have the right kind of client where I could do that.
Yeah.
Just maybe my sketch would be my that I send to him would be this,
Yeah,
where I sketch it out in oils. I think Dave
Dave
Palumbo
Palumbo
started
does it.
doing
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
there's a whole art form to dealing with clientele, I think, and especially when it comes to sketches. That I find if I do too good of a sketch, then
Ah, yeah.
they expect those exact colors. They expect all these
Right.
things. Whereas you want to give them just enough to envision the best painting possible without actually laying it out. And I think the way Dave approaches these loose sketches is really good for that. Greg Manchess, his thumbnails very rarely have much detail in them. They're mostly shape and lighting so that, then he can
Which is
improvise
true of his
later.
finals.
Yeah, true.
That just like fits perfect with his finals too. He creates so much with so little.
I know you cleaned off your palette. We're working still here. I'm guessing this is probably that light red color and some black and maybe a little raw sienna in there.
Yep,
Okay.
exactly. Yep.
Okay.
So it's a fairly rich color,
It's
on my palette.
still the same color you used for her hair and for the initial kind of shadowy colors, essentially.
That's right.
Okay.
So,
And you use black commonly in your work. You don't feel this
oh
need to
yeah.
mix your own black when you do portraiture or anything?
No, like do a chromatic black mixture or
Yeah.
something like that. No, but man, it makes a beautiful black to, when I do that, I will mix alizarin, phthalo green, and ultramarine blue, and it makes a really beautiful color.
Yeah. Even just phthalo green and alizarin alone make a fantastic,
That's
rich,
true.
purpley black. That, in fact,
Yeah.
mentioning Dave Palumbo, I know that's his black, and it has such a great tone to it.
I just, before I move off of that or kind of move sideways to that, one of the things that I love about chromatic mixing a black like that is when the edges of it mix with a lighter color,
Yeah.
because you start to see what it really is, so you start to see those purples and greens right along the edges. Norman Rockwell, you see that a lot of Rockwells, where he would have that white background for the post covers,
Yep.
and you'd have these dark colors up against it, and they're so rich, just high saturation in the colors where it transitions from the dark to the light.
I think so many students are afraid to use black because it's just been drilled into their head that it's their enemy. But I think the
Yeah.
real issue is that people tend to stop thinking about what the black is accomplishing. Is it a warm black? Is it a cool black? Again, not being very
Right.
deliberate. So do you kind of always mix your black with something? Are you using it to just alter? Do you ever just use black to shade stuff?
I do almost always mix it with something. And I find where people get in trouble with black is when when it causes discrepancies in their saturation levels, and then it messes with the color harmonies. So they will use black to darken, to create a shadow, but not add colors in to increase the saturation of
Gotcha.
that color.
Okay.
And so it starts to create that muddy, dirty looking color. But like right here, there's a lot of black in this mixture, but I also added a lot of the light red in there to keep it very saturated.
So to correlate it back to the Photoshop thing, this would have been the bottom right corner where it's very dark and very rich in
Yes.
color still. Okay.
That's right.
This looks great already, Howard. Like
Oh,
just seeing the way you're
this-
picking out the shadow tones, it's really such a great sense of form already.
She has such intense color right in that transition to the shadow that we'll try and capture right here. It's very beautiful.
Now you were mentioning,
I've got a
and again, I'm probably filling people's heads with nonsense. You were mentioning that your instructor always mentioned to put the highest chroma originally at that terminator, at that transition color.
right.
I do actually do the same thing, but I've always been taught that that's where you see the true local color of an object, that the light takes on the characteristics of the light source, the shadow takes on the characteristics of the environment, and that one spot is the true local color of whatever it is you're painting.
I don't disagree with that. The part that I disagree with is that should be the most saturated part.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think the shadows that are well served to be the most saturated, other than like where flesh meets flesh or lips or nostrils, because those tend to have the most punch in terms of saturation. But I do agree that if you're looking for what color something is, that's where you look for it. Is right where that transitions. I'm not getting quite yellow enough right there. So I am going to introduce Cad Lemon into this mixture, just to get a little bit more color contrast right there. We might be getting a bit of glare. I don't know. Is that color coming through?
Yeah, it is. Yep.
Oh, good.
Actually, I quite like seeing the glare, actually, seeing how we can see how thick the paint is, which is great.
See texture there. Yeah.
Now we're kind of focusing on heads here because they seem to be the most complex areas of color and stuff. But you're applying these same principles and stuff everywhere on the figure. Do you have any other sort of hard, fast rules for hands or anything like that compared to heads even?
Yeah, the fingers and toes tend to be kind of like the nose, where it's going to get redder, whether they're very fair skinned or very dark skinned or olive skinned. You're going to see more reds in the fingers and toes and the nose and the ears, kind of those extremities. And you've got more capillaries close to the surface. There's a
just
lot of
more red, or is it also more saturated, or is it really just
more saturated, but only subtly.
Yeah.
It's a little more saturated where you get to the nose and you get to the fingers.
But it's mostly a hue shift, you think?
It's mostly a hue shift, I believe. That's kind of been my observation. But then your biggest saturation changes are going from light side to shadow side. She has such a cool change in color across her face. Paint her all day. So I'm getting a little too focused, I think, on some of the little things before I've got everything blocked in. So I'm going to finish blocking in before I get carried away here. Like I was saying before, what's nice about blocking in and not getting too involved in details early on it allows you to address specific components of the problem and not try and tackle everything at once. So I have to remind myself as I'm working, like, don't paint all the leaves on the trees.
Don't paint all the scales on the dragon.
That's right, exactly.
It's such a can of worms.
There's time for the chainmail later.
All right, so that color there, I know that wasn't, well, actually make that the right color first, and then we'll address that a little bit. I would love to see how, say, that mid-tone on the forehead relates to some of the shadow tones on the lighter person's face.
Oh, interesting.
Like, just we can really, I mean, and they're close enough that we can kind of eyeball things, but I'd love to really see it exact. Is there a spot on the Caucasian face you think, like, can you guess even where that value and color is pretty close?
I would guess that this value right here is going to be close to this value right here.
The one you've yet to paint. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So not the direct highlight, because I haven't done the highlight yet, but right next to it. feels like close to this shadow color here.
Gotcha.
So should we see?
Yeah. Pretty close.
Pretty close. It was a little bit darker.
That's cool. And so you're still like, it looks in general to me, and maybe again, it's just an illusion. It's so hard to say that even the highlights on her skin right now are very rich in color, very saturated. You're still deliberately, though, pushing the saturation even further in the shadows?
Yes.
Okay.
But, you know, as we saw, like this color, I just painted over it with the highlight, was very close in this color here, which over here doesn't look very saturated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for those listening, man, if you want to try and refine your understanding, make a video like this. It helps so much to vocalize it as you're doing it.
You know what? That's absolutely true. I feel like I've learned more through teaching than anything else, because you have to put your thoughts into words, and you realize like you're thinking all the time when you paint, but the moment you actually put it into words, you're stating something. You're making a rule out of it almost, and you start to realize, you know what? Maybe that is what I do. That is what I'm thinking, and it helps you be so much more astute about your own choices. Otherwise, it's just this weird nagging voice in my head all the time, just like, you know, mixed with doubt. I don't know what I'm doing.
Right. Well, it helps too, like, when you do it, try and get Dan to watch and ask questions along the way too. Because you ask great questions. But even just trying to have a friend, you know, that is an artist that can ask you questions. Why are you doing that? You know, what do you think?
Yeah, why are you doing that? I think that is the most important thing to ask yourself. Why am I doing this? Why am I?
Yeah. Right.
Oh, this is looking.
And I think that. Go ahead.
This looks great already. That's such a good forehead. This looks like a finished like man chest.
Obviously, I am working too hard.
Yeah. I think of that all the time. I think, man, Greg gets paid more than I do, and he's doing so much less work.
He's getting like $100 a brushstroke.
Yeah. And when I say less work, it's not less work. It's less.
Yeah.
It is less brush strokes.
Right.
Less labor, maybe.
Right. He is more efficient, that is for sure.
Yeah.
So in this one, I'm doing a little bit better of working from area to area. It does help because I'm able to make some significant comparisons on my palette.
That color you just put down is so yummy. Yeah, let's see what that looks like on your palette. Can you show us that again? And so we have very few now, it feels like, of those really cool bluey purple colors we had before. Maybe we're just not there yet. But
yeah, I think we'll see a little bit more when I refine down here. But you're right. I mean, I just don't see as many of the grays that we saw with the other model.
Yeah. I think it's worth pointing out, you know, obviously we're painting a black girl and a white girl, but there's so much variation, even in somebody of a dark complexion, that somebody who's Nigerian is going to look completely different than somebody who's, you know, Egyptian or something.
Yeah, I had a model from Ethiopia, and she didn't have nearly the beautiful red. She had these really gorgeous kind of cool gray undertones instead of red undertones. Yeah. And I've never painted people from this ethnicity, but I think it's in northern India, and their skin is very gray. Yeah. Like there's very little reds in it, at least from photography that I've seen. I want to go to India and paint there. It's just the variety of people in India is amazing.
Yeah, I think in that part of the world in general.
I definitely acknowledge that much of my understanding of history and art is very Western centric. I mean, I don't think that's too unusual, but it's unfortunate, and I want to fix that. You know, I need to read more histories of the Far East and of India and China and study that art because there's so much there.
I think it's also it's one of the unique things and a little bit of a downside about illustration is that it's almost entirely an American phenomena because of
Yeah,
printing and literature and stuff. And obviously, there's a lot of illustration in France and there's always been illustration throughout Europe. But, when you really think of the great heyday of illustration, that's pretty much just an American thing.
right,
So I mean,
right,
it's obvious that our background is going to come from sort of this white Anglo-Saxon approach to it. But
right. I wonder had Britain stayed more on top, um, because we started to see some gorgeous illustration coming out of England right at the turn of the century.
right,
But then the world economy so much changed and everything shifted over to America. But I wonder, like, was Rackham
yeah.
published first in the UK or was it all driven by a US publisher? I
Oh,
don't know.
I don't know. I don't know. And I assume that there's probably a lot to do with prosperity in a country as to how much people
Right.
read. Women aren't reading Ladies' Home Journal if you're being bombed. You know.
Right.
So,
Yeah, yeah. She has this gorgeous orangey red color on her lower lip that's very intense. I want to try and
so yummy. These colors are so luscious,
actually
Howard. This looks great.
they
Now let's talk about
they're
you're
fun to
painting
paint.
region to region. So I'm noticing you're not just scrubbing a big base color over everything and then trying to push that dark and push that light. You're kind of separating each area of light and shadow. Is that for a reason? Is it bad to do it the other way? Like, why do we even have the gray here? Is that not messing up your choices?
It that's a great question, and I found that I've done it both ways, and I find that painting kind of from area to area, kind of tiling a little bit, um, makes me think about each brushstroke more.
Does it help
And
keep your color cleaner or anything? Or
it does, and kind of how I was saying before, that if you do that, kind of following Sargent's advice, um,
Sargent painted out of
I'm
midtones, right? Did he not?
yeah, he would establish the midtones, but he would resolve things area to area. But if you look at his unfinished pieces, there's this really cool image. I think Gurney posted it, but it's kind of made its way around. If you just Google, I think, Sargent unfinished portraits, it's like probably has 50 or 60 images on it from the least finished to the most unfinished, like the almost finished but still unfinished. And you can kind of get a good sense of his process from that. He would block in from like he would mass in the light and the dark side, and it was an average tone of the light side and of the dark, and then he would
Ah,
start refining.
gotcha. So he's not truly painting midtones. He's just kind of taking out the extremes and still painting light and shadow.
That's
Okay.
what it looks like to me. That's my interpretation of what I'm seeing.
Like it looks like you could almost leave that highlight on the nose as is, as the
Yeah, just
highlight
leave
there.
that
Yeah.
space right there.
Yeah.
I'm not brave enough to do that. Some of these features, the color's so wonderfully intense it almost feels like straight cat orange. So, and I'm painting, for the most part, I'm just painting over where highlights would be, and I'll come back in and hit that. And I do that because it feels like I'm able to get continuity in the form um, easier by just painting over the highlights. But then we can just take advantage of the strength of oils and paint right over the top of an area.
Well, I think that's
No
important to
problem.
be structural in your brush strokes.
Yeah.
Somehow, if you're
All right,
too
let's,
perfect, it doesn't look, it looks plastic if you're too perfect.
right. Let's see if we can get that highlight color. And this is where I'm kind of crossing back over into this value and chromatic range, getting these highlights. I've got a little too much color in that highlight. I'm going to gray it down.
I've always found, and I know a lot of this is environment, that the highlights tend to be much bluer on a dark-skinned person than on a light-skinned person. But I think a lot of that just has to do with reflecting the sky or something.
Yeah,
But
that may be the case. And it would be interesting, kind of how we did that comparison in Photoshop to the blue gray versus the gray that appeared blue.
yeah. Hmm.
You know, if you took that color and just grayed it down, the flesh around it, and then lightened it up, if it would appear blue enough.
Yeah. If that blue is still just as blue on a Caucasian person's head too, we just can't make it out, you know?
Yeah. So here, let's try some. I'm going to mix up straight ivory black and titanium white, and let's see how blue it looks.
Oh, man. What is that
Maybe
gray?
not.
You almost nailed the background color on it. But
Yeah, that's right.
maybe
It's
a
like it
little
looks like
more
I just
black might make
scraped
it
back
bluer.
through it.
Yeah. But there is a nice tonal difference there. I quite like that.
I like broke the bone in her head right there. I'll fix that.
Oh, that's okay. Don't worry.
I can't leave it. So I am, in talking about trying to be deliberate with my mixes, you'll notice I'm not doing too much just like paint there. You know, I will put a color down and then I'm going to go back and mix again.
And every time you're going back to mix, what's going through your head? Do you kind of know what you're going for specifically?
Yeah, usually, like when I put that down,
Oh man,
I'm going to
that pink
think
is great. That made that cheek come to life.
just starting to get blood underneath there. So when I put that down, now I'm thinking first, is that right? You know, do I like the color that's
And
there?
how do you judge
If
it by it being right? Are you
ah
questioning specific things again? Like you're just saying saturation, value, hue?
yes, just kind of walking through the properties of the brushstroke. You know, is it the right shape? Is it the right value? Is it the right saturation? Is it in the right place? Does it reflect the anatomy that's underneath it? And a lot of those questions, I think, become intuitive. You know, as you're painting more and more, it's like, oh, that feels right. If it doesn't feel right, then you walk through all of those properties and say, okay, what is it the right shape? Okay, it's the right shape. Now, is it the right value? And kind of marching down the list, and it will help you problem solve.
Awesome.
Um, so if assuming all of that is right, then I'm just looking at, okay, what's next to it? You know, what's my next mark that I'm going to make? And what does it look like in relationship to the one that I just made? I was just in Portland and went to the Gamblin Paint factory.
Oh, I saw the photos. That looked amazing.
It really was. It was neat to see, and I've found not that I've done a lot of tours or things like that, but most companies like that, they're set up to do that. And like Gamblin, they have someone there, and that's part of their job.
Yeah.
So if you're ever in Portland, just go to the website and contact them.
I was
But
also really surprised, and I don't mean this as an insult, it's actually kind of a compliment, at how
yeah,
low tech it seemed. That you would think this
very.
is all just coming out of a big stainless steel machine, pushing it into a tube, but it was a guy mixing the stuff.
That's
Like,
right. And like the machine that they were using to tube their paint was actually a toothpaste
oh,
tubing machine, and they said they liked it better than these big expensive ones made specifically for paint because it was just simple,
just,
just did the job they needed it to.
yeah. That's no, and I like seeing the human hand in there just to make sure everything is just right. There's
And
there's an old story. I
yeah,
can't remember where it came from. Maybe I watch a lot of documentaries while I work. But there was a sausage factory one time, like, James Dean or something that's making like sausages, and they were curing sausages in a room, and they had this old, crappy, rundown factory, but their product was spectacular. And they ended up being profitable enough that they built a great new factory and computerized everything and like a custom room just for smoking everything. And somehow it just didn't taste the same. And they couldn't figure
that's
out
great.
what was going wrong. And it turned out that the process of moving the sausage from one room to a different room across the factory had given it time to kind of like cool to a certain temperature and do all these
Wow.
subtle things that were getting missed out on when it was just done the perfect way, that
Yeah,
it just
yeah.
lost some of that. So seeing this paint factory and seeing like, yeah, if that paint came out of a machine every time, I feel like it'd be less consistent. That you need that human hand to say this feels right a little bit.
Yeah, and I I agree. It was really cool to see, and they only have, I believe, they said 24 employees, and that includes for distribution.
Wow, are you
Um,
kidding me?
yeah,
Wow.
really small operation. And so, like, one of the guys on the video, it's like, "How long have you been doing this?" He's, "I've been doing this for 10 years," and he switches between like burnt plate mixing and oil color mixing,
Oh.
and it is his job. Like, they have tubes of paint there that are their kind of registration for the colors, like what it should look like. And it's a real art form,
Yeah.
um, where he does it like a drawdown
Uh,
test with the paint and compares it by eye,
oh, neat.
and then makes adjustments as needed. And the consistency of the paint is all determined by how many times he like feeds it through the mill. And it was very cool.
Oh, that's really remarkable. I
Yeah.
wish I got to see that.
Yeah, next time Portland, make sure you stop by. Google Maps does not take you to the right place. We were late for our appointment because it took us like a few blocks away. So we're about there with this. I don't think I'll do whites of the eyes and that. I don't think it's adds. Though the whites of the eyes are interesting. It depends on the person, obviously. But if the person hasn't been around a lot of smoke or pollution, their skin color tends to be an almost completely gray orange. So if you mix just a tiny little bit of orange in with mostly white and some ivory black, it will look blue. And that's the color that I've found, like on little kids, that just is perfect.
This is in the whites of the eyes you're referring to?
Yeah,
Oh.
yeah, the sclera.
Yeah. Oh, this is
So
great. Cool. We're pretty close to done here, Howard. We maybe have 15
awesome.
minutes if there's anything we want to address specifically. Could we maybe see, I know you could make this painting look more and more beautiful as every brushstroke you're doing is just looking better. Since we didn't get to do a mid-toned one, could we maybe talk like a real crude head if, say, this was lit by a blue light source or something, how you might still treat, a complexion under a different kind of light?
Sure.
I know
I
that's
laugh because it'll be like,
you
all
gotta.
right, let's see what happens. But I think what I will do is I'm going to mix up on my palette, and I'll show the palette, but we'll do this real quick. I'm going to mix up those color relationships because we talked about like a little more yellow on the forehead and then a little more red in the cheeks and cooler on the chin. So I'm going to mix up a blue that has a little more yellow in it for the forehead and then a blue that has a little more purple.
Cool.
And we'll start there.
And you don't even have to make it look like a head. It could be a cue ball or something if you want.
Could be anything. Yeah. Okay, cool. But we'll try and use the exact same principles that we've been talking about in terms of saturations.
So we're kind of starting in our neutral environment right now. And we'd think of it almost like when you were putting those photo filters over Bouguereau. It's just the
Right.
relationships of everything are getting shifted a little bit.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'll probably start with something like this. Just a nice blue. That is ultramarine, ivory, and white. And then I'm going to mix to get it a little bit more creamier on the forehead. And usually I would mix this with my palette knife. But for the sake of time, I'm just being a little bit faster.
Do you mind showing us while you mix? It's okay.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks. Yeah, that'll be more interesting than just the same thing up there, huh? Okay, so
what's the difference? Did you add orange to that second mixture, or what's in there?
I added raw sienna to it. So yes, a darker orange. Mm-hmm. So then I'm going to take this mixture. This is ultramarine blue and ivory black here. And I'm going to create a mixture with a little more ivory black in it to be my darker color, to be my chin color. Because I still want it to be blue, but I just want it to be a little colder. And I'm going to keep them all in similar value just for the block end. Okay. We'll do this right in the middle here, and we'll just do one straight on. Okay. I'm going to do a darker version of my middle color we'll just create some shadows. It'll help us have that contrast and turn things. So what I'm imagining is painting someone where the light is actually blue. I think that's kind of what you were saying too, rather than the cool light, but the light is actually blue.
Yep, exactly. Yes.
So if it's 100% blue, then it'll eliminate some other colors, but we'll assume there's a little bit of the spectrum in there still.
Yeah.
So kind of like I did when you saw me start here and here, I just tinted the cheek to indicate a little bit of blood in the cheek. And I'm going to bring that into this shadow too. Because our light is primarily blue, I'm not going to warm up the eye sockets in this case because I imagine it reflecting a lot of blue in that scene. A lot of the color that you get in the eye sockets isn't from the capillaries under the skin like it is on the nose and the cheeks. It's from the color that it's reflecting up into the eye socket. So let's see.
It's such a downward facing plane.
Exactly. Now, turns that my color's really close to the background.
It's like exact. Yeah.
We'll slowly work our way around to that. So I'll go ahead and give a little more sense of form up there. Okay, and then moving into the cheeks, I've got my little more saturated blue that I can add a little more red to, and let's see how we do. Jeff Miracola was with me at Gamblin, which I know you saw, but for those watching, and he posted a neat little video on YouTube of walking through Gamblin. I'm actually going to do a Muddy Colors post on it too.
Oh, awesome.
But with Jeff's permission, I'll ask him. I'll include the video in it because he took a lot more video. I took more stills. But it's great. It gives you an idea of the size of the factory that we were in and kind of how they did their thing. It was really neat. Let's see.
I'm quite liking this color palette already.
It's kind of fun. It makes me want to do more with it. So knowing that our color temperatures are full of blue, we're going to keep that consistent in the lips and not go too warm red in it. And then the lower lip, we'll keep a nice cold pink. It's a fun kind of mental exercise. You know, I'm trying to keep the same kind of temperature relationships at blue by everything. I'm going to go back into the light side. I've used the same brush for everything that we've done, but I'm going to go back into the light side, so I went ahead and quickly cleaned it out with again. So
Yeah, I think it's also worth noting about, going back to the notion of subtlety in Bouguereau's work and stuff, that being super sensitive to your brush and just even like that little bit of color that doesn't belong on there is enough sometimes to shift things, to make it
right.
not work. Like, especially when you're at that level of subtlety where every little
Yeah.
bit matters.
Yeah, so much of his effect that, like we saw, was from saturation shifts, and so you got to be pretty clean.
Yeah, I see a lot of students that just paint too messy. It's like they're wiping off their brush or they're stabbing it into dirty turp and then wondering why their colors aren't clean, or they wipe their brush in a dirty rag and then that's getting into the next color they mix up, and just not being
Right.
as sensitive as they need to be to it. Are you making up this head, Howard?
Yeah.
This is great. This is where you can see all your life painting experience come in. Just the shapes of your shadows are on point.
trying to think about planes while I'm not airplanes. Speaking of airplanes, everyone knows at the Smithsonian, the Space Aeronautics Museum, but there's another wing of it out by the Dulles Airport.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, it was so fantastic. It was better than the one on the mall by far.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they have one of the space shuttles is there. The Enola Gay was there, which was,
Oh, that's cool.
it's an important plane to see. SR-71. It was so good. Are you, this is off topic. This is off to the side, but it is still relevant to our audience. The Portrait Society Conference.
Oh, where is
I'm
it
looking
this year?
forward to going to that again this year. It is in Reston, Virginia,
Oh,
just
again,
outside.
close to me. All right,
Yeah,
maybe this
very
year I'll have to do it.
close to um, Dulles Airport.
Does
Like
it
it's the. Go ahead.
does it overlap Dragon Con again?
See, I don't know. I think it was Spectrum Live that it overlapped
Oh,
last year.
that's what it was. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But what a great conference. I've thoroughly enjoyed going there and learned a lot. Last year I got to chat with Daniel Sprick
Oh,
quite
awesome.
a bit and was so impressed with his work. Let's see. I got a little bit too light there. I want to turn that form a little more convincingly, I think.
Are there any good I know you've kind of dug up a lot of this Bouguereau stuff on your own. You take a great interest in it. Are there any good resources you'd recommend to people to specifically learn color or even just painting the forms of the face that you go back to over and over?
You know what? The best resource, and this is going to sound a little cliche, is painting from life. I haven't found a lot that's written that I feel like has been better than what I've learned just consistently working from a model.
Are there any specific life painters you look toward for inspiration, even if just in style?
I really love Jeremy Lipking's work.
I knew you were going to say that name.
Yeah, I think he's doing wonderful things. Just how he's stylizing. Someone else that is killer is Nick Alm, a Swedish painter.
Can you spell that last name, or even close?
ALM.
Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
he there's something about his palette that is just, it's like, it's rich and beautiful olives and these colors that I don't know, we just don't see all the time in paint mixtures. I used to live in Norway, and the light up there is not what I see in his paintings being in Sweden. So I'm curious, it's like, it doesn't feel like that cold northern light in his work. So maybe it's all indoor, or I don't know. I don't filtered some way, or maybe I just didn't see it. But
there's looking at this face now, it's really coming to and thinking about different palettes that we can use with the stuff. I mentioned some of those films that sort of have this green filter, which kind of give things a dark, edgy mood to it. But, this palette, this looks, I could see if you're doing a horror painting that this palette might be more appropriate than, say, the first one you did, if you're trying to paint a villainous or something.
That's a good point. The colors themselves are kind of disconcerting. It doesn't look like he's in lighting conditions necessarily that would be cozy and by any stretch. And what can we do to this to experiment just a little bit more?
You want
interesting.
You want to indicate some shadows and like a rim light on one side or something? Like, kind of make it a little fantasy-ish?
Good idea. Kind of.
Like, what happens if, I know we did such a blue palette, what happens if we went for like a neon blue rim light on one side?
Cool, yeah. I'll try it. Hopefully anyone watching this, like as Dan and I are just kind of talking through this and just saying, what if? What if we did this? That's useful to do. Yeah. Especially, and you've seen this doesn't take very long.
Like, I'm curious to everything looked so blue when you first mixed up the palette that now I want to see a true blue there, what it does to it.
Yeah.
That's great. Beautiful. Yeah, it's just making the other colors look even more subtle.
Blending a little bit.
Do you ever do multiple light sources for your life setups?
You know, I just started doing that. In fact, I can go grab one real quick
Oh
and
no,
show it.
that's okay. I'm just curious. Like I know you normally have one typical light source setup, but I've yet to see
Yeah,
you do a multiple.
I've posted a few lately. That, they're easy to miss because they kind of add up. Um, where I've been doing a cool primary and then a really warm secondary light.
Ah,
And
nice.
what I've learned from that is that having that contrast of color temperature has been very revealing to the color temperatures that are there. I see the warm relationships faster with the cold light there to inform me,
Ah,
if
nice.
that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, we actually, I learned, like you mentioned, I learned more from life painting than I think I learned from anything else in college. And our setup was always an extremely cool north light coming through a skylight, and then a really warm lamp spotlighting something else, behind them. And
That's cool.
yeah, you really can see the relationships so well.
That's awesome.
Howard, this looks great. I don't know that you need to push this too much further for our benefit.
All right.
But thank you so much for taking the time. I know people watching this are probably aware that you're in your home studio right now across the country, taking time out of your day to do this for this. I really appreciate
Happy to
that.
do it. Yeah, absolutely.
Any parting words or anything you'd like to add or anything you've been up to?
Let's see. I just finished with Dan. This was a lot of fun. We both did some illustrations for Brandon Sanderson's Oathbringer, and I'm really proud of the work that I did, and I'm also really proud to have it in the book with Dan's illustrations. If you don't know Sanderson's work, that they are, and you like fantasy, this series is worthy. Like, it is really a great one to read.
I'm so stoked. I just downloaded the audiobook yesterday.
Yeah, I'm about a third of the way through it. It's been fantastic to listen to.
It
So
turns out I
highly
missed
recommend
Edge
it.
Dancer, so I had to go back and do that first.
Oh yeah, that was good. Yeah,
Your
an
pieces for
Arcanum
that came
Unbounded.
out fantastic, Howard. You have prints and stuff of
Oh,
those,
thank
don't you?
I do. Yep, I've got some prints of those on my site, and um, that that's been they've been really great to work with. Dragon Steel Brands Company.
Howard, I'm going to challenge you with one more thing. What if could you
Yeah.
give this person white hair, either like a Rococo wig or a modern white hair, and see what that does to the complexion of their
Nice.
face?
Okay, I like the idea of a Rococo wig. That's pretty fun. Let's see. I'm gonna see how far I can push these shadows. How if you go all the way back to the first part of the video on the computer with that very first Bugaro image, if you remember
The
where the
white
skin
shirt?
met the hair.
Oh,
Well, the white
gotcha.
shirt, that'll be good reference, but where the skin met the hair, it was almost the most saturated part of it. So I'm gonna do that and put in some really rich blues in order to create the transition to the hair.
That looks
I'm
great
just gonna
already.
indicate.
And of course, I added the rim light to make things complicated for you.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, let's see. So I'm going to mass in some of the hair real quick.
Look at that.
And we'll go a little darker over here.
It's looking very Mead Schaefer now.
Nice.
We didn't even bring any of that up, but some of those great duotone illustrations from Mead Schaefer where he's just using Viridian or just ultramarine blue or even just cad red, and you can still absolutely get a sense of that, the skin being skin, that it feels like
Right.
you could still tell who has dark skin, who has light skin. And I assume he's just doing the same thing you're doing, just with an even narrower range available to him.
I loved that post that you did on those, the duotone illustrations.
Thanks. Those are some of my favorites. I love, just talking about the Zorn palette and making things uncomplicated so you can really get down to what's important. I love seeing like Mort Kunstler. It's like, wow, how much he can do with just red and black.
Yeah. Yeah. The first 30 years of the 20th century were marked with a lot of black and red illustration because of the printing technology. And man, they got good. Lyon and Cornwell and Schaefer and Rockwell at shifting temperatures to create the illusion of flesh and create depth, just by putting more or less black into the mixture. It was really amazing.
This little head study might be my favorite one of the bunch, Howard.
Yeah, nice. It's just invented.
Yeah, the colors, I mean, it's nice seeing how you come to them. Because if I were to start off with all of this in my head and try to be like, okay, I'm going to paint a very gray face or a very blue face, I don't know that it would be a great bigger mess than this. But just seeing you subtly just add warm or add cool or add saturation, looks great.
It's probably a good example of having imaginative realism informed by life,
Yeah.
because it is drawing upon experience of painting from life, but then just saying, okay, I'm gonna shift these rules. I'm gonna add this coefficient to the equation and have everything kind of bump over one direction there.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Howard, again, thank you so much. I really appreciate you doing this. This was a fantastic demo. I could watch you do this all day.
Oh, well, thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to have done another one of these for Muddy Colors.
Yeah. And thank you everybody for watching. We hope to have some more good videos for you in the future.